On the morning of May 18, 1972, a dying man in Paris ordered his doctors to do something they told him might kill him. He wanted the intravenous drip pulled out of his arm. He wanted to be lifted from his bed, dressed in a blue blazer, and placed in a chair in the first-floor sitting room. The doctors compromised. The needle stayed in, but the tube was run under his shirt collar, and the bottle was hidden behind a curtain, so that his visitor would not see it. The visitor arriving that afternoon was Queen Elizabeth II. The dying man was her uncle, and 36 years earlier he had been King of England. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His throat cancer had spread so far he could barely swallow. But when the Queen entered the room, the Duke of Windsor forced himself up out of the chair, stood on legs that were failing him, and bowed his head to his niece. 15 minutes later she was gone. 10 days later, he was dead. Here is what almost nobody at his funeral knew. The house he died in did not belong to him. The city of Paris rented it to him for roughly the price of a dinner. The French government had excused him, a millionaire, from paying income tax, for reasons that were never made public. And in the final years of his life, a British Prime Minister had personally intervened to keep a set of captured German documents from destroying him. One of those documents contained a single sentence, sent by telegram to Berlin in the summer of 1940, that historians would spend decades arguing about. You will hear that sentence, word for word, later in this account. The story his obituaries told in 1972 was the story the whole world knew by heart. The king who gave up his throne for the woman he loved. 35 years of golden exile with Wallis Simpson, in a beautiful house at the edge of the Bois de Boulogne. The parties, the Duchess in Dior, the pugs eating from silver dishes. The greatest love story of the 20th century. The people who were actually inside that house described something else. They described a duchess who conducted a 4-year affair in front of her husband's face, with a man 19 years younger than her, while the duke sat at the same nightclub tables, paid the bills, and pretended not to see. The affair ended, according to one account, on a single night, over something that happened at a dinner table, and when you hear what it was, you will understand everything about that marriage. They described a former king who told one friend, decades after the war, that he had never thought Hitler was such a bad chap, and who spent his Paris evenings dining with the most notorious fascist Britain ever produced, a man who lived 20 minutes away. They described servants who were paid almost nothing, screamed at over the folding of a towel, and in one case, dismissed after decades of loyalty, in a manner so cold that the story still gets retold 50 years later. And they described the telephone. A man who had once ruled a quarter of the Earth's population, sitting in a borrowed house in a foreign country, waiting for a call from London. A job, a role, a title for his wife, anything. The call never came, and the reason it never came was decided in private, by his own family, in an arrangement that stayed hidden until the archives opened. None of this comes from rumor, it comes from Philip Ziegler, who was given the Royal Archives for the authorized biography in 1990. From Christopher Wilson, who spent years interviewing the Duke's own social circle. From Andrew Lowney, whose 2022 account was built on freedom of information releases the British government resisted. From the letters, the declassified files, and the recollections of the secretaries and valets who watched it all happen, and whose separate accounts, given decades apart, keep agreeing with each other. He was king for 326 days. He was an exile for 35 years. The love story was the cover version. What follows is what it was covering. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. In the third week of September 1945, a Royal Air Force plane landed outside Paris, carrying a 51-year-old man who had spent the war on the far side of the Atlantic. The city he returned to was 4 years into rationing, scarred by occupation, and short of coal, bread, and glass. The house he returned to was untouched. Number 24 Boulevard Suchet, the 4-story townhouse in the 16th arrondissement that the Duke of Windsor had leased before the war, had passed through the entire German occupation of Paris, without losing so much as a carpet. His furniture was where he had left it in 1939. His linen was folded in the cupboards. His wine, one of the finest private cellars in Paris, was still in the racks. All around the 16th arrondissement, the homes of the wealthy had been requisitioned, stripped, and looted by the occupying army. The dukes had been guarded. Andrew Lowney's 2022 account of the exile years, drawing on German and British archival records, describes what the preservation of that house actually was: a courtesy, extended by the Third Reich, to a man the Reich had never stopped regarding as a friend. The same courtesy had been applied to the Château de la Croix, the villa on Cap d'Antibes, where the Windsors had lived before the fall of France. German officers had used it during the war. They had kept it in good condition, and an inventory had been maintained, so that its contents could be accounted for. When the Duke walked back into his Paris house in 1945, he was walking into a piece of evidence, and he seems to have understood it as a convenience. He needed the convenience, because no other door in the world was open to him. The previous 9 years had reduced the most famous man on earth to a person without a function. In December 1936, he had abdicated the British throne after 326 days as King Edward VI, telling a radio audience of hundreds of millions that he could not carry his burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. The woman was Wallis Simpson of Baltimore, then in the process of divorcing her second husband. The broadcast made the marriage sound like the whole story. The financial negotiation that accompanied the abdication, reconstructed decades later by Philip Ziegler from the Royal Archives and examined again by Lowney, is where the story starts to change shape. During those negotiations, the departing king pleaded poverty. He told his brother, the new King George VI, that his private fortune amounted to roughly £90,000, and on the strength of that figure, he extracted a settlement, the sale of his life interest in Sandringham and Balmoral, and a private allowance from his brother's own pocket. The true size of his fortune, accumulated from 25 years of Duchy of Cornwall revenues while he was Prince of Wales, was over £1 million, held quietly abroad. He was, at the moment he claimed to be nearly broke, one of the richest private individuals in Europe. George VI discovered the deception later, and the discovery poisoned every financial conversation between the brothers for the rest of their lives. The allowance came with a condition, and the condition is the key to the next 35 years. The Duke would receive his money only so long as he stayed out of Britain, unless the king invited him. He had not merely left the throne, he had signed away the right to live in his own country. There was a second wound, and it cut deeper than the money. In May 1937, on the eve of the Duke's wedding, George VI issued letters patent, declaring that while the Duke himself would keep the style of Royal Highness, his wife would not. Wallis would be a duchess, but she would never be Her Royal Highness. No curtsies, no royal rank. The decision had been reached by the King, Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Mary together, and the government's law officers had supplied the reasoning. The Duke received the news days before his wedding, and, according to Ziegler's account, called it a damnable wedding present. He would spend the rest of his life relitigating those 3 letters. Visitors to his Paris houses in the 1950s and 1960s recorded that he could not get through an evening without returning to the subject. The denial of the HRH was, in his telling, the crime his family had committed against an innocent woman. Inside the family, the reasoning was simpler and colder. They believed the marriage would not last, and they were not prepared to have a twice-divorced American carrying royal rank into a third divorce. The marriage did last. The grievance lasted longer. Between 1945 and 1949, the Duke conducted a campaign, in letters and in person, to be given something to do. The record of that campaign survives in the correspondence Ziegler was permitted to quote. The Duke proposed himself as a roving ambassador for Britain in the United States. He raised the idea with his brother, with Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and with anyone at the Foreign Office who would receive him. The answer, delivered each time in the language of polite postponement, was no. The reasons were never given to him in full, and they were substantial. The Foreign Office held files on his wartime conduct in Lisbon and Madrid in the summer of 1940, files whose contents will be described later in this account, in the part they actually detonated. The palace held the private knowledge of the financial deception of 1936, and Queen Elizabeth, the king's wife, held a settled conviction, recorded by multiple courtiers, that the abdication had broken her husband's health and that the man responsible should never be allowed near public life again. So the answer stayed no, and the Duke stayed in France. He did not stay there out of love for France. He spoke of the country he lived in with detachment and spent as little of the year in it as he could manage, wintering in New York and Palm Beach, where the adulation was more reliable. France was simply the place that would have him on terms he could accept, and in the late 1940s the terms became remarkable. The French government granted the Duke exemption from income tax. No law required it. No parallel case explains it. It was a diplomatic courtesy to a former sovereign, negotiated quietly and never publicly itemized, and it meant that a man sitting on more than £1 million, with an allowance from Buckingham Palace and one of the great untaxed fortunes of the age, contributed almost nothing to the country that housed him. Customs privileges came with it. Purchases could be routed through diplomatic channels, sparing the household duties on wine, cigarettes, and the Duchess's couture. Susie Menkes and other chroniclers of the household later estimated the couple lived at a fraction of the real cost of their lifestyle, and the saved difference stayed in the Duke's accounts. He guarded those accounts with an intensity that startled the people around him. The stories, collected across every major biography, agree with each other. Guests noticed that the Duke would go through household bills, line by line, querying the price of vegetables. Staff wages at the Windsor houses ran below the Paris market rate, a fact that will matter later in this account when the servants begin to talk. When the couple dined out, others paid. An American friend told Christopher Wilson that an evening with the Windsors was an expensive honor because the former King of England had perfected the art of never seeing a check arrive. In 1951, the fortune grew again. The Duke published his memoirs, A King's Story, ghostwritten over 4 years and serialized in Life magazine, and the project earned him roughly $1 million. The book presented the abdication as a love story and the author as a man at peace. Its actual effect inside the family was the opposite of peace. George VI regarded the publication of private royal matters for money as a betrayal, and courtiers recorded the palace's fury. The brothers barely communicated in the year that followed. They never repaired it. In February 1952, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham at the age of 56. The Duke sailed for the funeral alone. Wallis stayed in New York, and her letters to him during that crossing, published decades later by Michael Bloch, are among the most quoted documents of the exile, because in them she coaches her husband, in plain words, on how to work his brother's death. She reminded him to be nice to the new queen, his niece Elizabeth, because their financial future now ran through her. She referred to his mother and to the widowed Queen Elizabeth in terms of open contempt. The tone of the letters is the tone of a business partner steadying a nervous colleague before a negotiation. The negotiation failed. The allowance from George VI had been personal, and with his death, it stopped. The new court saw no reason to renew it, and the Duke, a millionaire pleading hardship to a niece who had read the file on 1936, got nothing. He recorded his verdict on his family in a private letter from that trip, quoted by Lowney, describing them as ice-veined bitches. He was writing about his mother and his sister-in-law. 13 months later, in March 1953, Queen Mary died. Her son flew to London for the second family funeral in as many years, and once again the visit produced no thaw, no invitation, no restoration. What it produced instead, 3 months later, was the single most public humiliation of the entire exile. On June 2, 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned in Westminster Abbey. Her uncle, the only living former sovereign, was not invited. The exclusion had been settled months earlier. The presence of a crowned and abdicated king at a coronation was judged constitutionally impossible, and privately, nobody in the family wanted him there. So the Duke of Windsor watched the crowning of his niece on a rented television set in Paris, at a viewing party in the apartment of an American hostess named Margaret Biddle, in front of 100 other guests and a bank of press photographers who had been invited precisely to record the spectacle. He provided commentary on the ceremony for an American press syndicate, for a fee. Photographs from that afternoon show him pointing at the screen, explaining the regalia of the ceremony that had once been his, to a room of paying strangers. He knew every object on that screen. He had rehearsed that ceremony for himself, 16 years earlier, in the months before he walked away from it. 3 weeks after the coronation, in June 1953, the Duke and Duchess signed the lease on 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, a 14-room stone villa standing in 2 walled acres on the edge of the Bois de Boulogne, with iron gates, a gatehouse lodge, and a curved gravel drive. The house belonged to the city of Paris. Charles de Gaulle had lived in it just after the liberation. The city offered it to the Windsors at a nominal rent, a figure so small that accounts of it range from a token sum to the famous $10 a year, and the arrangement, like the tax exemption, was never publicly justified. Paris wanted the ornament. The Duke wanted the discount. Both sides got what they valued. The year before, the couple had bought the only property they would ever actually own, an old converted mill called the Moulin de la Tuilerie in the valley of Gif-sur-Yvette, 22 miles southwest of Paris, where the Duke could garden and the Duchess could decorate. The mill was for weekends, the villa was the stage, and a stage is the accurate word, because what the Duchess of Windsor built inside that borrowed house across the following 2 years was recognized by everyone who entered it as something more deliberate than a home. It was a court in exile, constructed by a woman who had been refused the rank of Royal Highness, and designed so that no visitor could leave without understanding exactly what had been withheld. The Duke's standard flew from the roof when he was in residence. The same heraldic banner protocol had stripped from him. Footmen in royal livery lined the hall. The dinner service carried royal ciphers. Guests were received beneath a portrait of Queen Mary, and in the entrance hall stood the abdication desk itself, the table at which he had signed away the throne, displayed like a relic. Staff were instructed to address the Duchess as Son Altesse Royale, Her Royal Highness, the exact style the letters patent of 1937 had denied her. Inside those iron gates, the 1937 ruling did not exist. Inside those gates, she outranked the decision of the King of England. The court had everything a court requires, except the one thing that defines one. It had protocol, livery, precedence, and ceremony. It had no country, no function, and no purpose beyond its own nightly performance. The performance needed an audience, and the audience that assembled in Paris in those years, the Café Society millionaires, the fascist neighbors, the Woolworth heir with the yacht and the open checkbook, is where the story of these years stops being sad and starts being ugly. Because by the time the Windsors moved into the house in the Bois de Boulogne, the Duchess had already been conducting, for 3 years, in full view of Paris and New York, the affair that the Duke's friends could not believe he was tolerating. The man was 20 years younger than her. He was openly homosexual. He was paying for everything. And the Duke of Windsor, the man who had given up the greatest throne on earth for this marriage, sat at the edge of it, night after night, smiling for the photographers, while Café Society watched his wife and Jimmy Donahue disappear together and made its own arithmetic. What that arrangement actually was, who was using whom, and the single dinner table incident that ended it, is the next part of this account. In the spring of 1950, on a transatlantic liner bound for Europe, the Duchess of Windsor was introduced to a passenger from the first-class list, who made her laugh so hard that people at neighboring tables turned around. He was 34 years old, blonde, quick, fluent in 4 languages, and heir to a share of the Woolworth 5-and-dime fortune. His name was James Paul Donahue Jr., and everyone who mattered on 2 continents called him Jimmy. She was 53. Within months, the 3 of them, the Duke, the Duchess, and Jimmy Donahue, were appearing together so constantly in the nightclubs of Paris and New York that the columnists invented a word for the arrangement and called them a threesome in print. Within a year, according to the account Christopher Wilson assembled from the couple's own social circle for his 2001 book, Donahue and the Duchess were lovers. The affair, by Wilson's reconstruction, ran 4 years and 3 months. Everything about it was designed to be unbelievable, and that was its camouflage. Donahue was homosexual, flamboyantly and unapologetically, at a time when the act itself was a criminal offense in Britain and grounds for ruin in America. His conquests among the men of Café Society were legendary, and his indiscretion about them was total. Nobody looking at Jimmy Donahue holding the Duchess of Windsor's chair believed anything sexual could be occurring, which meant the 2 of them could go anywhere together, at any hour, and the world supplied the innocent explanation on its own. Wilson's sources, who watched it happen from the next table, eventually stopped believing the innocent explanation. So, on one particular day in New York, did the Duke. That day survives because a woman wrote it down the same week it happened. Anne Seagrim was the Duke of Windsor's private secretary from 1949, a discreet, devoted Englishwoman who kept private notebooks she showed to no one, and whose papers surfaced publicly decades after the deaths of everyone involved. In them, she recorded the day the Duke returned to their New York residence from the racket club, where an acquaintance had taken him aside and told him, in his own interests, that the Duchess had been out until dawn, night after night, with the same young man. Seagrim wrote what the 60-year-old former King of England did with that information. He went to his room, lay down on his bed, and turned his face away. She recorded him in tears. She recorded him, on a later occasion, begging his wife to break it off. The man who had stood in front of the world's microphones and traded an empire for this marriage was now pleading for its terms from inside it. The pleading changed nothing, and to understand why, you have to follow the money, because the money is the part of this affair that the romantic version of the Windsor's exile cannot survive. Jimmy Donahue never worked a day in his life, and never needed to. His mother, Jessie Woolworth Donahue, controlled a fortune estimated in the tens of millions, and indulged her son's every appetite on the sole condition that he remain hers to summon. Jessie had an appetite of her own, royalty. The Windsors were the nearest thing on earth to purchasable royalty, and Jessie Donahue, through her son, purchased them. When the threesome dined, Jimmy paid. When they occupied hotel suites in Palm Beach and Manhattan, the Donahue accounts settled them. Yachts, aircraft, casinos, jewelry for the Duchess from Cartier and Van Cleef, weeks of entertainment at a stretch. Wilson's book itemizes a subsidy that ran, by the estimates of people who watched it flow, into sums that would embarrass a government. The Duke of Windsor, whose horror of spending his own fortune has already been described in this account, had found the perfect solution to the cost of his wife's social life. Another man was paying for it. That the same man was sleeping with his wife was, in the coldest reading of the arrangement, the price of the discount. The Duke's biographers have circled that reading for decades, because the alternative readings are not kinder. Either he knew and tolerated it for the money and the peace, or he knew and lacked the will to end it, or he had persuaded himself against the evidence of his own eyes. Philip Ziegler, the authorized biographer, working with the Royal Archives, treated the affair with caution and declined to rule on what happened behind bedroom doors, while acknowledging the intimacy of the friendship and the misery it caused. Wilson, working from the testimony of the Windsor's own set, ruled on it flatly. Lady Pamela Hicks, daughter of Earl Mountbatten and a cousin of the Duke, endorsed the fact of the affair on the record. Between the cautious version and the flat version, the visible facts are not in dispute. For 4 years, the Duchess of Windsor organized her evenings, her travel, and her calendar around a man 19 years her junior, and her husband organized his around not noticing. What did she want from it? The people closest to the question left answers that agree in outline. Donahue was everything the Duke, by his late 50s, no longer was. The Duke's own conversation had narrowed to golf, gardening, money, and the injustice of the HRH. He drank through the evenings and faded before midnight. Donahue was cruel, hilarious, alive until dawn, and utterly unimpressed by the one thing the Windsors had left, their rank, which made him the only person in their orbit who treated the Duchess as a woman rather than a monument. Guests quoted by Wilson recalled her physically transformed in his company, laughing, lit up, 20 years younger. One of her friends put it in a single sentence that has been repeated in every account since: she was bored, and Jimmy was the antidote. There is also the darker current, the one Wilson's title points at. Donahue's cruelty was not incidental charm. He was a man whose recorded amusements included humiliations staged for their own sake, whose treatment of lovers and servants left a trail of settlements, and whose own family regarded him as dangerous. The Duchess did not fail to see this. By the testimony of those who knew them both, she saw it precisely and enjoyed the proximity. Her biographer Andrew Morton, in his 2018 account, describes the relationship as the Duchess's revenge on the smallness of her exile. Having been denied a court, She took up with the one courtier who could make the actual court of England look dull. The Duke absorbed it in public for 4 years. The photographs from those years, and there are hundreds, show the arrangement with a clarity that needed no caption then and needs none now. The Duchess and Donahue side by side, heads together, mid-laughter, and the Duke at the edge of the frame, smaller than his own clothes, holding a cigarette and a smile that does not involve his eyes. Café society read the pictures fluently. The jokes were open. At El Morocco and Maxim's, people watched the former king check his watch while his wife danced, and the watching was part of the entertainment. Whatever the abdication had cost him in 1936, these rooms were where the interest was collected. It ended in the summer of 1954, in a hotel in Baden-Baden, at a dinner table, in under a minute. The accounts of that night, assembled by Wilson from people in the immediate circle, differ on the trivial detail and agree on the event. The three of them were dining privately. The Duchess, irritated, criticized Jimmy over something small. The version most often repeated involves the garlic on his breath. Donahue, drunk and stung, lashed out under the table and kicked her in the shin, hard enough to tear her stocking and draw blood. The Duchess cried out. And the Duke of Windsor, who had spent 4 years not seeing what was in front of him, stood up, and in front of witnesses finally acted like a husband. He is quoted, in the version Wilson's sources preserved, telling Donahue, "We've had enough of you, Jimmy. Get out." Donahue went. The banishment was total and permanent. The calls stopped, the invitations stopped, the subsidy stopped, and the man who had spent 4 years at the center of the Windsor's existence was erased from it overnight, unmentioned in the Duchess's memoirs 2 years later, unmentioned by either Windsor in public for the rest of their lives. Café society noted the erasure and understood it. You do not scrub a friend from the record, you scrub an embarrassment. The coda came 12 years later and deserves its place in the account. Jimmy Donahue died in December 1966, at 50, in his mother's Fifth Avenue apartment, of an overdose of alcohol and barbiturates that the record left ambiguous between misadventure and intent. By then he had been discarded by the Windsors, sidelined by his family, and spent past even a Woolworth allowance's tolerance. The Duchess, informed of his death, is recorded by Wilson's sources as receiving the news without visible reaction and sending no public word. The man had financed 4 years of her life. His name never crossed her lips again. One question hangs over the whole episode, and it is the question that connects it to everything else in this account. Why did the Duke endure it? A king who had defied his government, his church, and his own family to get this marriage, now watched it mocked in public for 4 years, and did nothing until a torn stocking forced his hand. The biographer's answer, consistent from Ziegler to Wilson to Morton, is the answer that reorganizes the entire love story. He could not afford the alternative. Divorce, or even visible estrangement, would have converted the abdication retroactively into the most expensive mistake in the history of monarchy, and the Duke knew it, because his family had predicted exactly that outcome in 1937, and he had spent every year since trying to prove them wrong. The marriage had to be perfect, because the marriage was the argument. It was the entire case for the defense, the only justification he had ever offered the world for what he did in December 1936. A man in that position does not have a wife. He has a verdict, and he must live inside it, smiling, at whatever table it seats him. So he endured, and the household closed over the episode the way institutions close over scandals, and by the autumn of 1954, the court in the Bois de Boulogne resumed its permanent performance as the residence of the century's great romance. The dinners resumed. The photographers were readmitted. The Duchess's parties entered the years of their highest fame. 16 at table, white-gloved footmen behind the chairs, the food praised in 3 capitals, the seating charts studied like state documents, and it is inside those celebrated dinners, at that celebrated table, that the next part of this account takes place. Because the guests who ate at it left descriptions of more than the food. They described what the host talked about when the wine had gone around. They described a man 20 minutes up the road, the founder of the British Union of Fascists, whose place cards appeared at the Windsor table year after year until the end. They described toasts, remarks, and table talk about the recent war, and about who had really caused it, that some of them recorded in private and repeated for the rest of their lives. The prison and the affair were private failures. What was said at that table was a choice. Every New Year's Eve through the 1960s, a black car would arrive at one of the Windsor houses, carrying a tall, straight-backed Englishman in his 60s and his famously beautiful wife. Dinner would be served by liveried footmen. The two couples would see in the new year together, as old friends do. The husband's name was Sir Oswald Mosley. He had spent 3.5 years of the Second World War in a British prison, held without trial under Defence Regulation 18B, because his own government judged him too dangerous to leave at liberty while the country fought Germany. Mosley was the founder and leader of the British Union of Fascists. Through the 1930s, his black-shirted movement had marched through the East End of London, staged the violence of the Olympia rally, and campaigned against British Jewry with a rhetoric imported directly from Nuremberg. His wife, Diana, born a Mitford, had married him in October 1936 in a private ceremony held in Joseph Goebbels' drawing room in Berlin. Adolf Hitler attended the wedding and gave the bride a photograph of himself in a silver frame. She kept it all her life. Interviewed decades later, she described Hitler as fascinating company and declined every opportunity offered to her, until her death in 2003, to say the extermination of the Jews had made her regret the friendship. These were the Windsors' closest couple friends of the final 2 decades. The friendship was built on geography before anything else. In 1951, released from the disgrace of post-war England, the Mosleys bought the Temple de la Gloire, a small neoclassical house at Orsay in the valley southwest of Paris. The Windsors' mill at Gif-sur-Yvette stood a few miles away in the same valley. The two most notorious exiled households in France were, by the accident of the property market, neighbors, and the accident hardened into an institution. They dined at each other's tables through the 1950s and 1960s. They exchanged letters and visits. Andrew Lowney's account records the relationship running unbroken to the end of the Duke's life, and Diana Mosley remained close enough to the Duchess afterward to produce, in 1980, an affectionate biography of her. The relationship needs to be measured against what both households knew. There was no ambiguity about who Mosley was. His imprisonment had been front-page news for years. His post-war attempt at a comeback, the Union movement, campaigned openly against non-white immigration and kept him a pariah in the country of his birth. London society would not receive him, and hostesses who tried lost their other guests. The Duke of Windsor received him for 20 years, a former King of England, whose niece was Queen, whose every dinner guest was noted by the press of 3 countries, chose as his regular companion the one Englishman whose company could confirm every suspicion that had ever attached to the Windsor name. He made that choice annually, publicly, and without apparent hesitation, and the choice tells its own story before a word of the table talk is added. The table talk was recorded, and it is worse. The mildest testimony concerns what the Duke said about Germany itself. He had grown up half German by blood and wholly German by summer holiday, a grandson of the dynasty that had renamed itself Windsor in 1917 to hide its origins, and in the Paris years he stopped hiding his. Lowney quotes the remark the Duke made to Diana Mosley: "Of all listeners, every drop of blood in my veins is German." He spoke the language fluently at the dinner table, and sometimes called it his mother tongue. None of this, on its own, condemned him. What it did was set the frame for the statements that followed, because the Duke's Germanophilia had never been a matter of cousins and Christmas carols. It came with a politics attached. In 1966, in comments to an American newspaper, the Duke of Windsor set out his considered view of the Second World War, 21 years after the liberation of the camps. He said he had thought Britain and the rest could have been fence-sitters while the Nazis and the Reds fought it out. That was the public, printable version, offered to a journalist on the record by a man with every opportunity to say something else. It amounted to a former British head of state stating, for publication, that the war against Hitler had been a mistake of policy. The remark drew brief comment and sank, because by 1966 the world had filed the Duke under harmless, and harmless men are not held to their sentences. The private versions were sharper. The travel writer and historian Lord Kinross, a friend who saw the Windsors socially in the 1960s, preserved the sentence that has since attached itself permanently to the Duke's reputation. In conversation, the Duke told him, "I never thought Hitler was such a bad chap." The words have been quoted in every serious account since, including by writers otherwise sympathetic to the Duke, and no member of the household ever produced a denial that survived scrutiny. Set beside the fence-sitter interview, the remark stops reading like an aberration and starts reading like consistency. Publicly, the war had been unnecessary. Privately, its author had been misjudged. Then there is the testimony about the table itself. Andrew Morton, researching his 2018 account of the Duchess, interviewed a source whose parents had dined with the Windsors in these years. What the parents reported hearing, and what they repeated to their child with horror, was dinner-table conversation in which both the Duke and Duchess made plain their view that the world would have been better off had the extermination of the Jews been completed. The claim rests on second-hand family testimony, gathered decades later, and Morton presents it as such. This account repeats it with the same label. It does not stand alone. Guests across the Paris years, quoted in Lowney's book and elsewhere, recorded the Duke blaming the war on the politicians who had refused appeasement and on the Jews, as a pairing, in company, more than once. The pattern in the testimony is consistent enough, across unconnected witnesses in different decades, to constitute the corroborated picture. At the Windsor table, after the wine had circulated, the persecuted of the recent war appeared in the host's conversation as its causes. The Duchess's own politics in these years are thinner in the record, and the thinness is itself informative. She left fewer recorded opinions about Hitler than her husband, and her surviving remarks run to the social rather than the ideological. What she left instead was the guest list, which she controlled absolutely. Seating at the Windsor table was the Duchess's art form. Contemporaries describe her revising placement cards up to the hour of dinner. Nobody sat there twice by accident. The Mosleys sat there for 20 years. When the Duchess was widowed and failing, it was Diana Mosley who remained inside the circle, and the biography Diana produced in 1980 paid the friendship's debt in print, defending the Windsors against the accumulating evidence of the archives, with the loyalty of a woman defending her own record in the same court. The standard defense of all this, offered at the time by the couple's friends and revived periodically since, is age and emptiness. The Duke, in this reading, was a diminished man, parroting the prejudices of his class and generation, without power, without consequence, a pensioner of history whose opinions mattered no more than the opinions of any club bore. Some of the reading is even true. Gore Vidal, who met the Windsors socially in these years and left an account of the Duke's conversation, described a mind of spectacular vacancy, a man who could hold forth on cufflinks and kilts and the correct pronunciation of place names while saying nothing at all. The courtiers of his kingship had said the same thing privately 30 years earlier. Nobody who dined in the Bois de Boulogne came away describing an intellect. But the vacancy defense fails against the chronology, and the chronology is the point. The opinions the Duke aired in Paris in the 1960s were the same opinions he had acted on in the 1930s, when he had power, and in 1940, when he had opportunity. This was the man who, as king, had told the German ambassador he favored the closest cooperation between England and Germany, a conversation Joachim von Ribbentrop remembered so precisely that his defense lawyers at Nuremberg wrote to the Duke asking him to testify to it. This was the man who, 7 months after abdicating, had toured Nazi Germany against his own government's pleading, inspected its factories and its training camps, dined with Goering and Hess and Goebbels, met Hitler at Berchtesgaden, and been photographed returning salutes. The Paris table talk was continuous with all of it. The man had not curdled in exile, he had simply stopped being handled. And that continuity raises the question that the last part of the Duke's public life would force into the open, the question a British Prime Minister would personally exert himself to keep buried. If the sympathies were lifelong, what had the man actually done during the war, in the weeks when Britain stood closest to destruction, and he stood, unsupervised and embittered, within reach of German diplomats who wanted something from him? The answer existed on paper. In the spring of 1945, as the Reich collapsed, American soldiers advancing through central Germany reached a castle in the Harz Mountains, where the archives of the German Foreign Ministry had been evacuated for safekeeping. Among the 400 tons of files was a folder of telegram traffic from the summer of 1940, between Berlin and its embassies in Madrid and Lisbon, concerning a person the cables referred to by his initials and, in the decrypts, by a plainer designation, the Duke of Windsor. When the folder reached London and Winston Churchill read what was in it, his reaction was not to order an investigation, it was to attempt, across 12 years and 2 continents, involving a king, a president, and General Eisenhower, personally, to make sure no one else would ever read it. In April 1945, in the last weeks of the war in Europe, a unit of the American First Army reached Marburg Castle, in the hills of central Germany, and found what the collapsing Reich had tried to hide there, the evacuated archives of the German Foreign Ministry, 400 tons of paper, the diplomatic record of the Third Reich, complete, captured intact. Sorting that mountain fell to teams of British and American archivists, and within weeks one of them, an American historian, pulled a thin run of telegram traffic from the summer of 1940 and realized he was holding a live grenade. The cables ran between Berlin and the German embassies in Madrid and Lisbon, between June and August 1940, the precise weeks of the fall of France and the beginning of the Battle of Britain. Their subject was a British royal duke, at that time in flight from the German advance, sitting in the Iberian Peninsula, angry at his family and unattended by his government. The file would come to be known, from the castle where it surfaced, as the Marburg file. What the cables described was this: in the chaos of June 1940, the Duke of Windsor had fled the south of France into Spain, then moved to Lisbon, where he stalled. Churchill had appointed him governor of the Bahamas, an appointment universally understood as removal, and the Duke was refusing to sail. He was haggling with London, by telegram, over his conditions. Germany watched him haggle and decided he was purchasable. Berlin's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, ordered his ambassadors to keep the Duke in Europe. The operation that grew out of that order, run in its final phase by the SS intelligence officer, Walter Schellenberg, who arrived in Lisbon under a false name in late July, was codenamed Willy. Its methods, laid out in the cable traffic and in Schellenberg's own post-war account, ranged from the seductive to the absurd. Money, promises, secret emissaries, staged warnings that British intelligence planned to murder the Duke, even a scheme to lure the couple back across the Spanish border on a hunting trip and hold them. 50 million Swiss francs were discussed as the price of the Duke's cooperation. The plan's ultimate object was stated in the cables without decoration. If Britain could be brought to negotiate, or invaded and broken, Germany wanted a compliant king to restore, and the compliant king was to be the man who had already worn the crown once. A plot by Nazis, on its own, convicts nobody but Nazis. Plotters fantasize, that is their trade. The reason the Marburg file terrified London was never the German half of the correspondence. It was the passages reporting what the Duke himself was saying. The German ambassadors did not describe a man rebuffing them. They described a man within reach. They reported the Duke, in Madrid and Lisbon that summer, speaking against his own government's decision to fight on. And on August 15, 1940, 2 weeks after the Duke had finally, reluctantly, sailed for the Bahamas, the German minister in Lisbon sent Berlin a telegram reporting a message just received from the Duke through his Portuguese host, the banker Ricardo Espirito Santo Silva. This is the sentence, as it appears in the published file, translated from the German of the original. The Duke had asked to be informed as soon as action was advisable, and stated his readiness to make himself available at any time. Read it once more. A British subject, a former sovereign, in the summer his country stood alone, is recorded by a hostile power as leaving behind a channel and an offer, "Tell me when the moment comes, and I will come back." The word the cables used for that moment, elsewhere in the traffic, was the point at which the Duke might resume his role in a Britain that had made peace. The telegram is a German document, written by a German diplomat with every motive to inflate his own success, and the Duke's defenders have leaned on that weakness for 70 years. It is also dated, filed, corroborated in tone by the surrounding traffic, and was never meant to be read by anyone but its recipients. Propaganda is written for audiences. This was written for the file. Churchill saw the file in 1945, and his response, preserved in the government papers that Andrew Lowney and others later extracted, set the pattern for the next 12 years. He proposed destroying it. The king's private secretary was consulted. The palace's alarm matched Downing Street's. What stopped the burning was arithmetic. The Americans held microfilm copies. Historians on both sides of the Atlantic had catalogued the collection, and paper that many people have seen cannot be quietly unmade. So the policy shifted from destruction to delay. In 1945, and again in 1953, when Churchill was Prime Minister a second time and Dwight Eisenhower had moved from Supreme Commander to President, Churchill wrote to Eisenhower personally, asking that the Windsor file be held back from the joint Allied publication program of the captured German archives. Eisenhower, who had already lent his name in 1945 to the view that the file was probably enemy fabrication, agreed to the delay. Two heads of government, in writing, arranging the suppression of an archive to protect the reputation of one man. The letters survive. They were declassified into a world that had stopped being surprised. The historians broke the arrangement. The captured archives were being published, volume by methodical volume, by teams of British, American, and French scholars, and the scholars regarded the missing file as a corruption of the record. Word of its existence leaked through the profession and into the press across the mid-1950s, which converted the file from a secret into a rumor, and a rumor about a suppressed Nazi file on the Duke of Windsor was worse for everyone than the file itself. In the summer of 1957, the governments gave up. The volume containing the Windsor traffic was published that August. The Duke was in Paris when it landed. He was 63 years old, 16 years into retirement from even the pretense of public duty, and he now watched the newspapers of every country he had ever lived in print the Lisbon cables at length. From the house in the Bois de Boulogne came a formal statement, issued through his solicitors, and it did what his statements always did. It conceded the smallest possible territory. The German documents were, he said, in part complete fabrications and in part gross distortions of the truth. He had never wavered in loyalty to his country. The communications attributed to him through intermediaries were the invention of diplomats seeking to impress Berlin. Buckingham Palace said nothing. The British government, pressed in the Commons, offered the formula that His Royal Highness's loyalty had never been in question, a sentence its own files did not support, and its drafters knew it. And then the story died, and the manner of its dying belongs in this account, because it is a preview of everything examined in the closing part. The press of 1957 printed the file, ran the denial beside it, and moved on within the week. No commission examined the Duke. No interviewer put the August 15th telegram to him and required an answer, then or ever. He was a 63-year-old celebrity exile with a famous wife and a fixed public identity, the man who gave up everything for love, and the identity functioned as armor. To pursue the file to its conclusion would have meant concluding something about the abdication itself, about how narrowly the country had escaped its own king, and no British institution in 1957 had the stomach for that arithmetic. The file was allowed to become what it has remained, a specialist subject, footnoted in biographies, absent from the legend. Inside the villa, according to the accounts of the household in these years, the episode was processed as one more grievance. The Duke's private position, maintained to friends for the rest of his life, was that the publication had been an act of malice by his enemies in the government, timed to wound him. The content he did not discuss. Anne Seagram's papers and the recollections Lowney gathered agree on the household reflex. Every disclosure was an attack. Every attack was about Wallis, and the family in London was behind all of it. The possibility that the record was simply true had no standing inside those walls. A court with no country had, it turned out, one function after all: the permanent retrial of 1936, with a verdict fixed in advance. There is a detail from the Lisbon summer worth carrying forward, because it resurfaces in Paris, and almost nobody noticed. The Duke's host in 1940, the banker Espirito Santo Silva, the named channel of the August telegram, was not a wartime acquaintance discarded with the war. The families remained on visiting terms in the exile years. The Duke of Windsor kept, across his whole life, almost no friendship that demanded effort. He kept that one. Biographers have read the persistence both ways, as innocent society habit or as the tending of an old confidence, and the record permits both readings. What the record does not permit is surprise. The pattern of the Paris decades established across the previous parts of this account, was already the pattern of Lisbon, the same sympathies, the same company, the same conviction that the rules governing other men's loyalties were, in his case, impertinences. By the autumn of 1957, the file was published, the denial was filed, and the world had confirmed to the Duke of Windsor the lesson it had been teaching him since 1936. Nothing would ever be done to him. Whatever surfaced, the machinery of deference would absorb it. He would not be tried, or questioned, or even seriously inconvenienced. He would only be managed, at a distance, by a family and a government waiting for him to die. But the waiting had a texture, and the texture is the next part of this account. Because while the archives fought their slow war in London and Washington, the man at the center of them was living a daily life of almost unbearable emptiness, and the people paid to share it. The secretaries, the valets, the footmen inside the iron gates were watching everything. They watched the household books. They watched the marriage after Donahue. They watched what the Duchess did to the staff, and what the Duke did not do to stop her. Their wages were small and their memories were long, and when they finally talked, they supplied the testimony that no captured archive could, what the great love story looked like from the servant's side of the door. Dinner for the 4 smallest residents of the villa was cooked by a chef, plated on silver, and served at a fixed hour. The residents were pugs. Their names in the later years were Trooper, Disraeli, Davy Crockett, and Black Diamond. They wore collars from the best makers in Paris, and their food, guests swore, was prepared with more care than most Parisians' own suppers. The footman who carried those silver dishes was earning, by the figures Andrew Lowney assembled from household records and staff testimony, a wage below the going rate for far less demanding houses in the same arrondissement. That distance, between the pug's dinner and the footman's pay packet, is the truest map of the household, and the people who lived on the wrong side of it kept detailed mental notes for 30 years. The establishment they staffed was large for a childless couple in a borrowed house, around 30 in the Paris years, counting the villa and the mill together. A chef and kitchen understaff, footmen and a maître d'hôtel, chauffeurs, ladies' maids, a valet, secretaries, gardeners at Gif-sur-Yvette. At the head of the below-stairs world stood Georges Sanègre, the maître d'hôtel, who ran the dining room for decades, and his wife Ophelia, who ran the housekeeping. The couple became the institutional memory of the place and stayed to the very end, long after both employers were dead. And moving quietly through the upstairs rooms was a tall Bahamian valet named Sidney Johnson, who had entered the Duke's service in Nassau in 1940 at the age of 16, when the Duke was governor there, and who had followed him across the Atlantic and given him, by the time this account reaches its final parts, more than 30 years of his life. Johnson's name should be held on to. What was done to him at the end of those 30 years is coming, and it is the coldest single story in the whole exile. The regime the staff served under was the Duchess's, and every account of it, from every decade, describes the same instrument of government, inspection. She toured her own house like an admiral touring a flagship. Fingers ran along surfaces. Cushions were measured against their creases. The published recollections of guests and staff, gathered in the Murphy and Bryan account of 1979, and in Lowney's interviews decades later, preserve the specifics with the vividness of people still slightly in shock. Bed linen was to be ironed after the beds were made, so that no human crease survived. Flowers were rearranged at midnight if the arrangement had disappointed at 10. The kitchen operated under siege conditions. Menus were composed, corrected, and recomposed daily by the Duchess herself, and a dish that failed could come back down the stairs with a message attached that stripped paint. Chefs cycled through the house at a pace the agencies of Paris learned to price in, and a housemaid could be, and was, screamed at over the folding of a towel, because in that house, a towel folded wrong was treason against the only kingdom the Duchess had ever been given to rule. That last sentence is the household's own diagnosis, and it recurs across the testimony in different words. The staff understood, with the clarity of people who watch their employers professionally, that the 14 rooms were a substitute. The woman who had been denied a court ran her house as one, and the discipline that a real court distributes across hundreds of officials came down, in the Bois de Boulogne, on cooks and chambermaids. Several of them, quoted anonymously in the later accounts, said they made their peace with the screaming, precisely because they could see what it was standing in for. Others made no peace and left. The wages, as noted, did not argue for staying. The Duke's line-by-line vigilance over the accounts, already established in this record, extended to every salary in the book, and raises stayed rare while the cellar stayed full. Yet the same testimony, and this is what makes it credible, rather than merely hostile, records the other side with equal precision. The staff who stayed were proud of the house. The dinners they produced were, by common consent, the best in private Paris. 16 at table, 5 courses timed to the minute, the food a studied fusion of French kitchen and American South, praised by guests who had eaten everywhere on earth. The Duchess trained her people relentlessly, and the trained ones knew their worth everywhere afterward. And toward the small circle of the truly loyal, the Sanegre, Johnson, a few others, both employers, showed flashes of real, if feudal, attachment. The house was a tyranny, the witnesses agree, but it was a first-rate tyranny, and some of its subjects loved it the way soldiers love a hard regiment. What the staff could not romanticize, because they saw it at close range every day, was the man of the house. The Duke's day, reconstructed from the valet's eye testimony in Murphy and Bryan, and from the household accounts Lowney collected, ran like this. He rose late, and breakfasted alone. He did the crossword. He golfed at St. Cloud, where his handicap and his companions were the most reliable appointments in his life. At the mill on weekends he gardened with genuine, strenuous passion, building the rock garden and hauling stones himself, the one activity in which anyone ever described him as fully alive. He fussed his clothes, changing several times a day, kilts in the evening in the tartans he was entitled to, and some he had invented, occasionally marching the garden with bagpipes, to the private despair of the neighbors. And threaded through all of it, the staff testimony agrees, he waited. He waited for the Duchess to wake, to return, to decide the evening. Footmen described him wandering rooms in the late afternoon, asking what time Her Royal Highness was expected, rehearsing small pieces of news to offer her. The great emptiness of the exile years, which the previous parts of this account traced through archives and scandals, existed for the household as a physical figure, a small, immaculate, aging man, standing in a hallway with nothing to do, listening for a car on the gravel. His wife's arrival did not always reward the waiting. The marriage the servants watched after 1954 was a settled, professional partnership with a fixed distribution of power, and the power was hers. Guests' diaries and staff recollections align on the public texture. She corrected him at his own table, cut off his anecdotes mid-story, dispatched him upstairs for a forgotten item like a page. The James Pope Hennessy visit of 1958 left one of the sharpest outside records. The writer, at the mill researching his life of Queen Mary, watched the dynamic across a weekend and described a household revolving entirely around the Duchess's moods, with the Duke orbiting her, anxious and eager, a man whose day was made or broken by her tone at lunch. Cecil Beaton, photographing and observing across the same years, recorded the same orbit in his diaries. None of the witnesses describe cruelty for its own sake, and several describe real tenderness, her fierce protectiveness when he was mocked, his open adoration. What they describe is an imbalance so total that visitors came away unsettled, having expected the century's great romance, and found instead its long administration. The Duchess herself, in the one remark on the subject that her friends preserved and every biographer has since repeated, framed her life's work in exactly those terms, telling a confidant that living out a legendary romance, day after day, was labor of a kind outsiders could not imagine. The remark was made wearily, and it deserves to be read that way. She had married an abdication, and the abdication required daily maintenance, the perfect house, the perfect dinners, the perfect appearance of the perfect marriage, forever, before an audience that was always secretly checking. The towels, the midnight flowers, the screaming at maids, the correction of her husband in company, the staff saw all of it as one continuous act of quality control on a product that could never be allowed to fail in public. The product was the marriage. The customer was history. The product even went to market. In 1956, the Duchess published her own memoirs, The Heart Has Its Reasons, and the manufacturing process behind that book, witnessed from inside the house, says more than the book does. The first ghostwriter engaged, the American writer Cleveland Amory, quit the project in 1955 in a break the press gleefully reported. His stated difficulty, elaborated in interviews for the rest of his life, was that the material his subject gave him could not be shaped into the sympathetic self-portrait she required. The job passed to Charles Murphy, the Fortune journalist who had already ghosted the Duke's book, who finished it in professional resignation, and who then took his revenge in the most durable way a ghost can. He waited, and in 1979 co-wrote with J. Bryan III, the insider account, The Windsor Story, from which so much of this part's detail comes. The couple's own hired pen, the man who wrote both halves of the official legend, spent his retirement documenting what the legend had left out. By the early 1960s then, the inventory of the exile stood as follows, and the household staff could have recited it. A borrowed palace, run as a substitute kingdom, a marriage conducted as a permanent exhibition, a master with no occupation but grievance, golf, and gardening, a mistress ruling 30 employees because she had been refused the right to rank above anyone, money everywhere, and generosity nowhere. And out beyond the iron gates, in London, a family that had not softened in a quarter of a century, a niece on the throne he had abandoned, and a sister-in-law, the Queen Mother, whose door remained the most firmly closed of all. Which is why what began to happen in the middle of the 1960s astonished everyone inside the villa. The telephone that had never rung, the one this account opened with, rang. Invitations that had been unthinkable since 1936 were suddenly, cautiously, extended. The Duke, old and ill, would stand once more on British ceremonial ground, beside the family that had exiled him, in front of cameras, while the crowds tried to remember what they were looking at. The thaw was real, it was late, it was very small, and the reasons behind it had less to do with forgiveness than with something the palace understood better than anyone alive: the management of how stories end. In December 1964, the Duke of Windsor, 70 years old, lay on an operating table in Houston, Texas, while the heart surgeon Michael DeBakey repaired an aneurysm in his abdominal aorta. The operation made front pages worldwide, and it delivered to Buckingham Palace a piece of information that changed royal policy more than 30 years of the Duke's letters ever had. The information was actuarial. The exile was going to die, and probably soon, and the House of Windsor was about to discover what it looked like when a former King of England died unforgiven, unvisited, and estranged, in front of the world's cameras. The palace began, very quietly, to manage the ending. The first move came within weeks. In February 1965, the Duke was in London, at the London Clinic, for surgery on a detached retina. His eyesight was failing, and the operations, 3 of them that spring, kept him in the city for months. And in March, for the first time in his reign as an exile, the door opened. Queen Elizabeth II came to the London Clinic to visit her uncle, and in that hospital room she met, and shook hands with, the Duchess of Windsor. It was the first time the sovereign had ever formally received the woman at the center of the abdication. No cameras were admitted. The palace confirmed the visit in a single sentence. Behind that sentence stood 29 years of refusal, ending in a sick room, between a monarch of 38 and a duchess of 68, with a half-blind old man in a bed between them. Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent, visited too, and the Princess Royal, the Duke's sister Mary, came twice. She died days after her second visit, and the Duke, bandaged eyes and all, attended her memorial service. The family was not embracing him. It was, in the precise sense, attending him, the way one attends the elderly, and the Duke, starved for 3 decades, received the attendance as affection, and pressed his advantage. Out of the London spring of 1965 came the one concession he had wanted almost as much as the HRH, and the only one he ever got. He asked his niece where he and his wife would be allowed to lie when they were dead. It was a real question with a humiliating backstory. The Windsors, barred in life from Britain, had assumed the bar extended to eternity and had bought burial plots in a cemetery in Baltimore, the Duchess's hometown, so that the man who had been crowned Emperor of India would be interred as a private American husband. The Queen ended that prospect. In 1965 she granted her uncle burial in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, in the private grounds of Windsor Castle, among the family that had expelled him, and she granted the same, when her time came, to the Duchess. It was, examined closely, the perfect emblem of the entire relationship. The family would take him back dead. But it was also, and the Duke took it as such, the first unforced kindness London had shown him since 1936, and he wrote his thanks in terms whose warmth, quoted by Philip Ziegler, startles against the ice of the preceding decades. 2 years later, the thaw was staged for the public, once, under strict controls. June 7, 1967, the centenary of Queen Mary's birth, a memorial plaque was to be unveiled on the wall of Marlborough House, and the invitation list, for the first time in history, paired the reigning family with the exiles. The Duke and Duchess came from Paris. Newsreel cameras recorded what happened on the pavement, and the footage repays close watching, because everyone in it is performing a different sentence of the same treaty. The Queen arrives and greets her uncle. The Duke bows to his niece. Then the Queen reaches the Duchess of Windsor, and the Duchess, 69 years old, in front of the cameras of the world, does not curtsy. She inclines her head, a nod between equals, and the Queen, who has read the same treaty, lets it pass. The Queen Mother, whose 30-year enmity with the Duchess was the coldest front of the whole war, exchanges with her a handshake and a few words measured in single syllables. 15 minutes of ceremony, no invitation to the palace afterward, no lunch, and the Windsors were driven directly out of the country they had entered that morning. One nod instead of one curtsy. After 3 decades, the Duchess had extracted her single public installment of the rank she had been denied, and paid for it by confirming every private judgment ever made about her. The Duke stood beside her, visibly proud. It was the only official public appearance the two of them would ever make with the royal family, and its news value, the palace noted, was managed, absorbed, and gone within a day. The ending was being administered successfully. There was one more London appearance, unplanned. In August 1968, Princess Marina died, and the Duke crossed once more for a family funeral, his third since the war, each one a door briefly opened by a coffin. By now the pattern was legible even to him. He told friends in these years, in remarks preserved across the memoir literature, that his family would receive him in England as often as somebody died. The bitterness had not softened, it had simply grown accurate. What the thaw never touched was the thing itself. In 1968, and again afterward, the Duke made a final approach on the question that had organized his adult life, proposing that the style of Royal Highness be extended to his wife at last, as a mercy to 2 old people. The answer from London, delivered through private secretaries with unfailing courtesy, was the same answer as 1937. The file stayed closed. The palace had calculated, correctly, that the Duke's capacity for rupture was gone. He was 74, frail, and in receipt of the Frogmore concession, and a man who has been granted his grave does not burn his last bridge. The request stopped. The grievance, visitors to the villa reported, did not. It merely completed its migration from campaign to liturgy, recited nightly, requiring no response. The Duke spent the closing years of the decade doing the one thing he had always done supremely well, performing himself. In 1965, a documentary built from his memoirs had put him back on screens. In January 1970, he and the Duchess sat together for a 50-minute BBC television interview, their only joint appearance of the kind, and gave the performance of the era. Silver-haired, immaculate, finishing each other's stories in the drawing room of the villa, they walked the interviewer through the authorized version one last time. The love, the serenity, no regrets, no bitterness worth the name. The Duchess was witty and steely. The Duke, when asked whether he had ever regretted the abdication, delivered his lifelong line with the timing of the actor he essentially was. Tens of millions watched. The reviews were warm. Nothing in the broadcast was true in the way it was framed, as every previous part of this account has established, but as television, it was unimprovable, and it fixed the couple's image for the last time while they were both alive to enjoy it. The sweet old exiles, wronged perhaps, dangerous never, love's pensioners at peace. Behind the image, the body was failing on schedule. The eyes, patched and operated, kept dimming. In the autumn of 1971, came a persistent throat trouble. The Duke had smoked heavily since boyhood, cigarettes without pause across 60 years, and in November 1971, a biopsy in Paris returned the finding the household had dreaded. Cancer of the throat, inoperable at his age. The word cancer was never used inside the villa. The Duchess forbade it, and the Duke was told, and chose to accept, a vaguer vocabulary. Through the winter of 1971 into 1972, he underwent cobalt radiation therapy, driven into Paris for sessions from which he returned smaller each week. He continued to dress for dinner. He continued, when strength allowed, to walk the garden at the mill among the stones he had set with his own hands. And in these last months the family came to him, in ones and twos, the visits of a peace that had arrived exactly late enough to be safe. Lord Mountbatten, his cousin and former shipmate, now the royal family's self-appointed fixer, called at the villa repeatedly, pressing the dying man, with an insistence the household found remarkable, on the disposition of his papers, his money, and his royal possessions, a campaign whose real purpose, and whose consequences for the widow, belong to a later part of this account. Prince Charles, the young Prince of Wales, holder of all the Duke's old titles, visited his great-uncle in Paris, and left a private record of the encounter, the old man courteous and eager, the Duchess flitting, the house a museum of a reign that had lasted less than a year. The generations inspected each other and understood nothing, which was probably the kindest possible outcome. By the spring of 1972, the Duke weighed under 100 pounds, and the radiation was finished, having failed. The doctors now practiced maintenance, not medicine. And it was into this endgame that the machinery of state finally, formally arrived, because Queen Elizabeth II was due in Paris that May, on a state visit to France. And a state visit runs on a printed program, and the program said that on the afternoon of May 18th, the Queen would take tea with her uncle. This account opened with what the dying man did to his own body that morning, to receive her on his feet. What it has not yet told is what surrounded those 15 minutes. The negotiation over whether the visit would happen at all, the photograph on the doorstep that the palace needed, the sentence the Duke's doctor later revealed about that afternoon, and the 10 days that followed, at the end of which the telephone in the villa rang at 4 in the morning, and the flag over Buckingham Palace did something it had never done for him in 36 years. The state visit to France in May 1972 had been planned for months, and inside the planning, buried in the correspondence between the Élysée, the British Embassy, and Buckingham Palace, sat one item that the diplomats handled like unexploded ordnance. The Queen's uncle was dying in the Bois de Boulogne, on the route of her official progress, and the schedule had to thread an impossible needle. If she did not visit him, and he died, the world's press would write that the Queen of England had driven past her dying uncle's gate. If she did visit him, and he died during the visit itself, a state occasion would collapse into a family funeral. The Foreign Office pressed the Duke's physician, a Parisian doctor named John Thynne, for something no doctor can give, a guarantee of timing. Dr. Thynne, who recorded the whole episode in testimony that surfaced years later, understood exactly what was being asked of him. His patient was required, as a matter of protocol, not to die inconveniently. The patient understood too, and had his own requirement. This account opened with what the Duke ordered done that morning: the tubes, the blazer, the chair, so it will not be told twice. What belongs here is what Dr. Thynne added afterward, that he had warned the Duke the exertion could kill him on the spot, and that the Duke had dismissed the warning as irrelevant, because the alternative, being seen by his sovereign in bed with a needle in his arm, was a form of death he ranked higher. Thynne also recorded the arithmetic nobody spoke aloud that afternoon. The cancer had reached the stage where the Duke could no longer eat solid food. The man in the blazer receiving the Queen weighed less than the dog's combined dinner service. Downstairs, a second performance ran in parallel. The Duchess of Windsor received Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, and the Prince of Wales at her own door, and gave them tea in her own drawing room, and somewhere in the choreography of that doorstep, according to the reporting of the day, the 75-year-old Duchess did the thing she had refused to do on the pavement of Marlborough House 5 years earlier. She curtsied. Whether it was surrender, exhaustion, or simply the tribute a hostess pays a guest who has come to say goodbye to her husband, no witness could say, and the Duchess never explained it. The Queen went up alone with Prince Charles for the 15 minutes with her uncle. What was said in that room, none of the three ever disclosed. When the royal party left, The photographers on the pavement got the picture the palace needed. The sovereign, the widow-to-be, courtesy on both faces, the long war invisible. Then the cars pulled away, the state visit resumed, and the house began its final 10 days. They were quiet ones, by the household's account. The Duke could take almost nothing but liquids now. A rotation of nurses covered the nights, and it is from one of them, a Baltimore-born nurse named Juliana Chattard Alexander, who later gave her recollections to her hometown paper, that the last close portraits come. She described a patient still capable of charm and command in the same breath, waving away a poached pear, presented in crystal on a silver tray, and sending the valet back for the one thing he did want, a single cigarette, carried in on the same silver salver. 60 years of tobacco had put the tumor in his throat, and he smoked at it to the end, one cigarette at a time, served like a course at dinner. She described something else, and it lands harder. In her 3 weeks of nights in that house, she said, the Duchess almost never entered the sick room. She saw her there on her first night, and then not again until the last one. The great romance, in its final chapter, was conducted through closed doors and staff reports. The wife downstairs managing the house, the husband upstairs managing his exit, each performing composure for an audience of servants. On the evening of Saturday, May 27th, the Duke's breathing changed, and the household knew. The American physician the Duchess had summoned from New York had already examined him and told her plainly that nothing more could be done. Late that night, the Duke sent his wife to bed, telling her the night nurse would look after him. The exchange, preserved in the household record, was gentle and ordinary, a man dismissing his wife to rest as he had 10,000 times. In the small hours of Sunday, May 28, 1972, with the nurse at his side, the Duke of Windsor stopped breathing. The time was recorded as 2:20 in the morning. He was 77 years old. One account from inside the room, repeated with caution in the later literature, records that in his final wandering, he called for his mother, the woman who had never once, in 35 years, agreed to receive his wife. The account may be embroidery. It has been allowed to stand because everyone who knew him found it plausible. The telephone call went to London before dawn. At Buckingham Palace, the flag went to half-mast, an honour the living man had not commanded there since 1936, and the court declared mourning. The official announcement spoke of the Queen's deep grief. The obituaries rolled out across the planet in the language this account began with, the throne given up for love, and for 1 week, the legend and the corpse travelled together in perfect step, because a funeral is the one ceremony at which no one checks the story. What the palace now staged was a masterclass in the management of endings, and it is worth watching closely, because every choice carried 36 years of calculation. The body was flown home on Wednesday in an RAF VC-10, received at RAF Benson with royal honours, and taken to Windsor. There, in St. George's Chapel, where he had been christened, and where as king he had never been crowned, the Duke lay in state for 2 days, and here the palace received its one genuine shock of the week. They had planned for modest numbers. Roughly 60,000 people came, queuing for hours down the hill and through the castle precincts, filing past the catafalque in silence, most of them old enough to remember 1936, some in tears. The dead man had been out of the country for a generation, and yet the line kept forming. Whatever the archives held, whatever the family knew, a residue of the Golden Prince of Wales of the 1920s, the most popular human being in the empire before the fall, had survived everything, and it walked past his coffin for 2 days to prove it. The Duchess flew from Paris on the Friday, aboard an aircraft of the Queen's flight, and was driven to Buckingham Palace, and with that drive, one of the longest sieges in modern royal history ended in the strangest way possible. The woman whose exclusion from that building had been absolute for 36 years, over whom a king had fallen and a family had broken, entered it at last, as a widowed houseguest, to sleep 3 nights in a state suite overlooking the Mall. She was 75, newly alone, medicated for her nerves, and, by the accounts of those attending her, intermittently adrift. The hardening of the arteries that would later destroy her mind had begun its early work, and grief and sedatives finished the picture. She asked repeatedly about details of the arrangements. She wandered topics mid-sentence. The household assigned to her was kind, the Queen's manner toward her Witnesses agreed, was kind, and the kindness itself was the final verdict. She was no longer worth a war. On the Saturday morning came the moment the photographers of the world had waited for without knowing it. June 3rd was Trooping the Colour, the Queen's official birthday parade, and it went ahead in mourning dress, black armbands on the scarlet, and at its centre, the massed pipes and drums played the lament, Flowers of the Forest for the Dead Duke, the parade ground falling still around it. In Buckingham Palace, alone, the Duchess of Windsor came to the window of her rooms to watch, and a photographer on the Mall caught her there, a thin white face at the glass, half-curtained, looking out at the ceremony of the family that had finally let her in. The picture ran everywhere and has never left the iconography of the century since. Whatever else it shows the terms of admission. She was inside the palace at last, and entirely, perfectly alone in it. June 3rd was also, though hardly a newspaper noted it, the couple's wedding anniversary. 35 years to the day since the ceremony in France that no member of his family had attended. The funeral itself, on Monday, June 5th, at St. George's Chapel, was private by design, the family's design. No state funeral, no procession through London, no lying in state in Westminster Hall where kings lie. Inside the chapel, the full apparatus nonetheless assembled, the Queen, the entire royal family, the Prime Minister, and at the heart of the service, a piece of heraldic theatre that resolved, in one sentence, the question of what the dead man had been. Garter, King of Arms, proclaimed the styles and titles of the deceased in the ancient form, and the proclamation named him what no living voice at court had called him in decades. Sometime the most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, King Edward VIII, sometime king. The court that had spent his lifetime managing him now, with the body safely in its box, restored him in full, for the length of one Latin-ordered sentence, to everything he had thrown away. The Duchess sat through it beside the Queen, who was seen, at the moments the widow faltered, to touch her arm and guide her through the services standing and sitting, a niece steering her aunt through the burial of the man who had preceded her father on the throne. Witnesses close to the Duchess in those hours preserved two of her remarks, and they make a fitting pair. Looking at the mountains of ceremony, she is recorded as saying that he had given up so much, for so little. And to a friend, more simply, he was my entire life. Both statements were true. Neither was the whole of it, as 5 decades of this account's evidence has established. They buried him afterward in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, under a plane tree, in the plot his niece had granted him 7 years earlier, a few hundred yards from the castle of his birth. The grave was dug wide, with space at his left side held empty, per the 1965 agreement, for the woman he had traded a crown for. Then the family went in to lunch at the castle, and the Duchess of Windsor, declining to stay a further night, was driven to Heathrow and flown back to Paris the same afternoon, to the borrowed villa, the 30 servants, the pugs, and the museum of a marriage, whose other exhibit was now in the ground in England. She walked back into that house a 75-year-old widow with a failing memory, alone for the first time in her adult life, in possession of one of the most valuable private estates in Europe. The jewels, the money, the furniture, the royal papers, the relics of a king. And within days of the funeral, before the flowers in the chapel had been cleared, the 2 campaigns that would consume and darken her remaining 14 years were already moving. One was run from London by the royal family's tireless fixer, and its target was everything in the house that had ever belonged to the crown. The other arrived through the front door in Paris, wearing the black robes of a French lawyer, and its target, in the judgment of the people who watched what followed, was everything else, including the widow herself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 10 days after the funeral, a letter from Lord Mountbatten arrived at the villa in the Bois de Boulogne, and it set the tone for everything that was about to happen to the Duchess of Windsor. It was warm, solicitous, family-toned, and it wanted things. Specifically, it raised the question of the late Duke's papers, his possessions of royal significance, and the destination of his fortune, and it proposed, helpfully, that Mountbatten himself assist the widow in settling all 3. The campaign had actually started before the death. In the last year of the Duke's life, As touched on earlier in this account, Mountbatten had made repeated visits to the sick room, and the household had noted the pattern of his conversation: wills, archives, heirlooms. Now, with the Duke gone, the visits and letters resumed at a pace that the Duchess's circle described as relentless. Mountbatten's stated concerns were, on their face, legitimate. The house contained objects that arguably belonged to the crown rather than to the man: royal orders and decorations, ceremonial swords, papers touching the monarchy's business, the accumulated relics of a Prince of Wales and a king. Precedent said such things returned to the family. Mountbatten went further. He pressed the Duchess to leave the bulk of the entire estate, money included, back to the royal family, or to a foundation he proposed to create in the Duke's name, with himself among its stewards. He drafted ideas for her will. He raised the matter at lunch, in letters, through intermediaries. He told her, in words that circulated widely afterward and hardened her against him permanently, what David would have wanted. The Duchess's reaction, preserved in her own letters and in the accounts of her Paris circle, was cold fury. She had sat through 35 years of the family's arithmetic regarding her husband, and she could do sums of her own. The same institution that had refused the living man a role, a title for his wife, and a place in the country was now, with the body barely settled at Frogmore, asking the widow to return the assets. To a friend she remarked that they had taken everything from him while he was alive, and now wanted the rest. Her resistance had one perverse consequence that shaped the rest of the story. It convinced her that she needed a protector against London, a wall between herself and the family's emissaries. She found one, and the protection would prove more total than anything the family had ever attempted. Maître Suzanne Blum was a Parisian lawyer of formidable reputation, then in her 70s, a survivor of an era when a Jewish woman at the French bar had needed to be twice as hard as every man in the room. She had represented film studios and famous estates. She had known the Windsors' legal affairs since the post-war years, when her firm handled their French matters. In the vacuum after June 1972, with the Duke dead, the Duchess failing, and London circling, Blum moved from lawyer to gatekeeper to, within a few years, something for which the law has no clean word. As the Duchess's arteriosclerosis advanced through the mid-1970s, dissolving her memory and then her competence, power of decision flowed to the woman who held the papers and the keys. Blum controlled access to the house. Blum decided who saw the Duchess, which meant, increasingly, that no one did. Old friends telephoning from London and New York were told Her Royal Highness was too tired. Invitations died at the gate. The woman who had run the most exacting dinner table in Paris disappeared, alive, into her own bedroom, behind a lawyer's switchboard. What happened inside that sealed house across the following years was documented by a witness the ceiling failed to anticipate. In 1980, the writer Caroline Blackwood, commissioned by a London newspaper, set out to interview Blum about her famous client, and the encounters unsettled her so deeply that she spent the decade turning them into a book, The Last of the Duchess, published in 1995, after Blum was safely dead and beyond the libel writs she promised on the smallest provocation. Blackwood's portrait of the aged lawyer is one of the most chilling in modern biography, a woman who spoke of the Duchess with a proprietary passion that shaded into fantasy, who declared her love for her client in one breath and controlled every molecule of her existence in the next, and who threatened, in conversation with Blackwood, to have people shot for lesser intrusions. Blackwood interviewed the remnants of the Duchess's circle, and the picture they assembled was of a captivity, a dying woman, incapable of instruction, in whose name her lawyer sold assets, granted and refused permissions, and administered a shrinking court whose only remaining subject was the sovereign herself. The selling is documented in the record of the estate. Through the later 1970s, while the Duchess lay incommunicado, items began leaving the house: paintings, objects, pieces of the collection, disposed of discreetly through the market. The stated purpose was the maintenance of the household and the funding of the Duchess's care, and some of it plainly was. The scale and secrecy of it, and the absence of any competent principal consenting, left a permanent shadow over the administration that French law never examined, because no one with standing ever forced it to. The royal items Mountbatten had pursued travelled a quieter road. Over time, through negotiation between Blum's office and the palaces, the papers of royal consequence and certain objects went back to Windsor, the archives taking custody of the documentary remains of the abdication. London, in the end, got most of what it had wanted. It simply got it from the lawyer instead of the widow, and paid the price of never having to say thank you. But the fullest measure of the new regime, the one this account flagged at its beginning, was taken within weeks of the funeral, and its victim was not a duchess or an archive, it was the valet. Sidney Johnson was in his late 40s in the summer of 1972. He had entered the Duke's service in Nassau as a boy of 16, and given him, without interruption, more than 3 decades. Dresser, barber, keeper of the wardrobe of the best-dressed man of the century, night companion of the final illness. The Duke, who bestowed nicknames as other men bestowed tips, called him Little Man, taught him valeting to the standard of St. James's, and by every account, returned the attachment as far as his nature allowed. In his will he remembered Johnson, and the household understood the intention that Johnson would be kept on and looked after. The Duchess dismissed him within months of her husband's death. The accounts of the dismissal, given by Johnson himself in later interviews and corroborated in the household literature, agree on its substance and its manner. Johnson, a widower, had asked for adjusted hours to care for his 4 children, whose mother had died. The Duchess refused the adjustment, and, when he could not comply, ended 32 years of service outright. There was no pension from her, no letter, no farewell audience. The man who had dressed a King of England for 3 decades left the villa with his memories, and, famously, one keepsake. The Duke had once given him a trunk of his own shirts and shoes, tailored objects of no use to anyone else alive, since the Duke's measurements were practically a child's. Paris society, which had watched the Duchess's household discipline for 20 years without surprise, registered this one with something colder. Even by her standards, the discarding of Sidney Johnson was read as a message. The Duke's court was dissolved, the Duke's loyalties were not inherited, and sentiment had died at Frogmore with its owner. The story has a coda so strange it must be included. 15 years later, when the Paris villa's lease passed to the Egyptian businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed, who restored the house as a shrine to its former tenants, Al-Fayed sought out Sidney Johnson and hired him back, as custodian of the wardrobe he had kept for the living man. Johnson spent his final working years among the Duke's suits and uniforms, curator of the clothes of his dead employer, in the house he had been expelled from, and died in 1990, months before the restoration opened. Of all the people this account has passed through, the valet is the only one whose loyalty was never once repaid at its value by either Windsor, and the only one nobody ever accused of wanting anything. The rest of the staff followed him out in stages. Through the mid-1970s, the establishment of 30 shrank toward a skeleton, the chef gone when the dinners stopped, the footman gone when the guests stopped, the chauffeurs reduced when the Duchess ceased to leave the property. Georges and Ophelia Sanègre stayed, nearly alone at the end, keeping the forms of the house for an employer who no longer knew the day of the week, and it is through their persistence that the final descriptions exist: the drawing room lit and empty, the table laid by habit, the standard no longer flown, the pugs dead and not replaced. By 1980, the Duchess was bedridden, fed by tube, her speech gone, her weight recorded by visitors' rumour in figures that belonged to famine reporting. She lived like that, sustained by nursing and law, for 6 more years. The doctor's bills were paid punctually. Nothing else about her condition can be called care. The friends who tried to breach the wall left a record of failure that Blackwood collected like evidence at an inquest. The Countess of Romanons, one of the last admitted, described her final visit in the late 1970s, the Duchess tiny in the bed, unable to speak, her eyes, the Countess insisted, aware, following her visitor around the room, weeping without sound. After that, even she was refused. Lady Moseley, up the road at the Temple de la Gloire, the last survivor of the old dinners, telephoned and wrote, and was declined like the rest, and complained bitterly of Blum to anyone who would listen, an irony this account will leave standing without comment. In the final years, the loudest voice raised in England and France against the imprisonment of the Duchess of Windsor belonged to the widow of the leader of the British Union of Fascists. One transaction from these locked years reached daylight only after everyone was dead, and it points forward. In the late 1970s, with the Duchess incapable, Blum granted the historian Michael Bloch access to the couple's private papers, the courtship letters, the exile correspondence, the archive of the marriage itself, and Bloch, working inside Blum's authority, began producing the series of books that put the Windsors' most intimate documents into print across the 1980s. The publications were framed as the Duchess's vindication, love's documentary proof, released with her lawyer's blessing while she lay beyond consent. Whatever their motive, they had a consequence Blum cannot have intended. Once the letters were public, historians could read them against the archives, the memoirs against the files, the legend against the evidence, line by line. The lawyer who sealed the living woman away had, in the same stroke, unsealed the marriage for autopsy. The autopsy's findings, the verdict's history, has since returned on the man, the woman, and the 35-year performance this account has followed, wait 2 parts ahead. What comes first is the ending. The ending itself required. The death of the Duchess of Windsor, 14 years after her husband, in the same borrowed house, and the second funeral at Windsor, at which the family buried, beside the man who gave up a kingdom for her, a woman most of them had met a handful of times, under a headstone whose wording was the last negotiation of the whole long war. The Duchess of Windsor died on the morning of April 24, 1986, in the bedroom she had not left for 6 years, in the house that had never belonged to her, 11 weeks short of her 90th birthday. The official cause was bronchial pneumonia. The truer cause was time, which had been dismantling her by inches for a decade, while the machinery around her kept the shell alive. Georges and Ophelia Sanegre were in the house. Almost no one else was. The woman for whom the 20th century's loudest constitutional crisis had been detonated died in a silence so complete that the announcement itself, issued through lawyers, felt like news from another era, a name most readers under 40 had to be reminded of. Buckingham Palace's response was flawless, immediate, and exactly as warm as it needed to be. The Queen sent condolences. The arrangements agreed 2 decades earlier, activated on schedule, an aircraft of the Queen's flight to Paris, the coffin received at RAF Benson with due ceremony, the body to rest at St. George's Chapel. The family that had spent 50 years keeping Wallis Simpson out of England now, for the second time, flew her in at royal expense, because the dead are so much easier to manage than the living. Nothing about the week that followed contradicted the observation. The funeral took place on April 29, 1986, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, before the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen Mother, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and some 170 mourners, and it became notorious for a single omission that no one present could fail to count. Through the entire service, the officiating clergy did not speak her name. Not once. There was no eulogy, no address, no biographical word of any kind. The liturgy proceeded on its rails, magnificent and anonymous, a funeral that could have been anyone's, which was, mourners on both sides of the argument concluded, precisely the design. The sole naming came at the committal moment, in the form of the barest identification the occasion permitted. Friends of the Duchess who had made the journey, the Countess of Romanones among them, left the chapel in open anger, and said so to the press. The Countess wrote afterward that the silence had been a final, deliberate act of erasure, a family declining to say aloud, even over her coffin, who the woman had been. Defenders of the arrangements answered that the Duchess herself had wanted the minimum of fuss. Both things were probably true, which is how that family preferred its cruelties, co-signed by the victim. One mourner's grief was reported as unmistakably genuine. The Queen Mother, then 85, the Duchess's adversary, across half a century, the woman whose court had coined the iciest of all the nicknames for her, attended and was described by those near her as visibly moved. What moved her, no one presumed to print. The two widows had outlived every other principle of 1936. Whatever the feeling was, it had no name the family would speak either. They buried her at Frogmore that afternoon, in the reserved space at the Duke's left side under the plane tree, completing the transaction of 1965, and on the headstone, when it was set, the last negotiation of the 50-year war stood recorded in its result. The stone reads, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 4 words, and a date. The 3 letters she and her husband had spent their exile demanding, the HRH that his court in the Bois de Boulogne had enforced within its own gates as consolation, were withheld from her in death as in life, permanently, in stone, a few hundred yards from the graves of the family that had withheld them. The Duke's own stone beside her carries his royal styles in full. A visitor standing at the plot can read the entire history of the marriage in the typography. Then came the will, and with it the final, perfect astonishment of the whole story. Through the summer and autumn of 1986, the disposition of the estate emerged from Maître Blum's office, and it contained a shock for every party that had spent 14 years maneuvering around the fortune. The royal family, whose emissary had lobbied the fresh widow for the estate, received effectively nothing of the money. The Duchess's remaining friends received trinkets or silence. The staff, including the Senegre's decades, were remembered on a scale the press found notable for its modesty. The bulk of everything, the money, and above all the jewels, the most storied private jewel collection assembled in the century, went to an institution with which the Duchess had no recorded connection of any kind. The Pasteur Institute of Paris, the French Medical Research Foundation. No letter explained the choice. The Duchess, incapable since the late 1970s, had assuredly not made it in any meaningful sense. The will's late codicils belonged to the years of her incapacity, which is to say, they belonged to her lawyer. Interpretations at the time ran from the redemptive, a childless woman endowing science in the country that sheltered her, to the acid, a Jewish lawyer directing the fortune of 2 famous anti-Semites into French medical research as history's driest invoice. Blum, who died in 1994, never explained either. The money went where the paper said. It remains the single most eloquent unexplained decision in the entire Windsor archive. The jewel's journey to Geneva provided the epilogue's epilogue. In April 1987, 1 year after the death, Sotheby's auctioned the collection over 2 evenings at the Hotel Beau Rivage on Lake Geneva, and the sale detonated every estimate placed on it. The catalogue's projection hovered around $7 million. The hammer total exceeded $50 million. At that date, the highest sum ever achieved for a single jewelry collection, and the auction room, packed with dealers, celebrities, and telephone bidders across 3 continents, turned into a séance. Elizabeth Taylor bought from her pool telephone in Los Angeles. Bids for individual pieces ran to 7, 8, 10 times estimate, and what the bidders were paying for was explicit in the room. Provenance, the physical relics of the century's official great romance, the panther bracelet from Cartier, the flamingo brooch of rubies and sapphires, the pieces inscribed in the couple's private code of anniversaries and endearments. Objects this account has traced through their truer contexts, gifts of the locked-out years, ornaments of the Donahue tables, assets inventoried by lawyers while their owner lay speechless, crossed the block as certificates of love, and the world paid $50 million for the certificate. The proceeds went to medical research, where, it should be recorded, they funded work of unarguable value, the one universally clean line in the ledger. And with the Geneva hammer, the physical estate of the exile was dispersed, and the story passed fully into the custody of the only court left, the historians. Their proceedings had already begun, and the 1980s gave them their evidence in floods. Michael Bloch's volumes of the private letters, issued from within Blum's authority, put the courtship and the marriage into print. The official biography of the Duke, commissioned with the Royal Archives open, was underway with Philip Ziegler and would deliver in 1990 the establishment's own measured indictment. The government files were declassifying on their statutory clocks. 50 years of managed narrative was coming apart on schedule, posthumously, safely, exactly as the managers had always intended it should, after everyone was dead. The house in the Bois de Boulogne had one more scene to play. The city of Paris, its famous tenants gone, assigned the lease in 1986 to Mohammed Al-Fayed, the Egyptian owner of Harrods and the Paris Ritz, who poured a reported fortune into restoring the villa to its 1950s state and reassembling its contents as a private museum of the Windsors, down to the abdication desk in the hall, and Sidney Johnson keeping the wardrobe, the arrangement already recorded in this account. The restoration complete, the shrine stood mostly unvisited, a perfect replica of a court that had itself been a replica. Then, On the last afternoon of August 1997, the villa brushed history one final time. Al-Fayed's son Dodi and Diana, Princess of Wales, divorced that summer from the heir to the throne, stopped at the house for half an hour on their way through Paris. Hours later, their car entered the Alma Tunnel. The house at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement thus holds a distinction no novelist would risk, the last home of the man who broke the House of Windsor's 20th century at its beginning, and one of the last addresses visited by the woman who broke it at its end. There, the physical story closes. The graves are side by side at Frogmore. The jewels are scattered into vaults on 5 continents. The papers are in the royal archives and the published volumes. The house is a museum of a museum. Every principal is dead. The Duke in 1972, Mountbatten in 1979, murdered off the Irish coast. The Duchess in 1986, Blum in 1994, Diana Moseley in 2003, unrepentant to the final interview, the last footmen and secretaries across the decades since, their recollections banked in the biographies this account has drawn on throughout. What remains is the question the whole 50-year performance was built to control, and it is the question this account has been walking toward since its first sentence. 2 stories now lie in the record, fully documented, side by side like the graves. In one, a king renounces the greatest throne on earth for love, and pays for it with a lifetime of dignified exile beside the woman he chose. In the other, a shallow and dangerous man is maneuvered off a throne he was unfit to occupy, to the immeasurable profit of his country, and spends 35 years in a borrowed house, proving the maneuver correct, while the institution he threatened builds, maintains, and polices the love story as the safest possible container for the facts. The evidence for the second story has filled 8 parts of this account, but evidence is one thing, and verdicts are another, and the verdicts, delivered by the archives, the biographers, and the family itself, across the decades since 1986, contain reversals and ironies that the evidence alone does not predict, including the strangest of all, the discovery of what Britain would most plausibly have become if the abdication had never happened, and the identity of the person who understood, better than any historian, exactly what had been dodged in December 1936. She lived to be 101, and she never spoke the Duchess's name in public either. In 1979, the historian Philip Ziegler was summoned to a meeting and offered a commission unlike any in British publishing. The royal family wanted an official biography of the Duke of Windsor, written with the royal archives fully open, every private letter and household file on the table, and the family pledged in advance not to censor the result. The offer itself was the tell. Institutions do not open their vaults to protect a reputation. They open them when they have concluded that the documents, read whole, will convict the man more thoroughly than any rumor, and that the conviction is now in the institution's interest. Ziegler worked for a decade and delivered in 1990, and the verdict of the authorized life, the establishment's own considered judgment, ran as follows. On the wartime file, he acquitted the Duke of the final charge, and convicted him of everything beneath it, not a traitor in the operative sense, never a man who would have marched in behind German arms, but defeatist, irresponsible, indiscreet beyond forgiveness, a man whose recorded conduct in 1940 gave the enemy every reason for hope. On the character, the authorized biographer was harsher than most of the hostile ones. His Duke was a case of arrested development, a man of charm without depth, self-pity without self-knowledge, whose intellectual world had stopped expanding somewhere in adolescence, and whose one adult conviction was his own grievance. And on the central question, the verdict that mattered most coming from inside the walls, the abdication had been, for Britain, an escape. Ziegler concluded what the courtiers of 1936 had whispered, that Edward VIII was temperamentally unfit for the throne he inherited, and that the crisis which removed him, whatever its costs to the man, had been the country's good fortune. The revisionists who came after the archives opened fully went further along the same road. Andrew Lowney's 2022 case, built on the government files and Freedom of Information releases, catalogued earlier in this account, dropped Ziegler's acquittal on the top charge and argued the word the older man had withheld, not a dupe, but a participant. a man who intrigued against his country's interest in war and peace, and was protected from the consequences by the only thing he had never renounced, his birth. Between the authorized verdict and the revisionist one, the difference is a single degree of intent. Neither leaves the love story standing. The love story had defenders, and honesty about this account's method requires giving them their full weight. Michael Bloch, who edited the couple's private letters from inside Metro Bloom's authority, built from them the sympathetic case that the correspondence shows real, durable, desperate attachment. A man who needed one human being more than he needed a kingdom and never wavered in the needing. The letters exist and say what he says they say. Diana Mosley's 1980 biography argued the couple's company was warmer, funnier, and kinder than the caricature, and she had sat at their table for 20 years, an eyewitness, whatever else she was. Francis Donaldson, whose 1974 biography preceded the archive floods, cautioned that the Duke's Nazi entanglements were as much vanity and stupidity as conviction, the folly of a man who craved importance and took it from whoever offered. And the fairest single sentence the defense ever produced belongs to the Duke's own lawyer, Walter Monckton, the man who steered him through the abdication and knew him better than any official alive, who wrote that his master was not a bad man, but a lonely and limited one, in a position that magnified limitation into catastrophe. The defense, taken at its strongest, amounts to this: weakness, all the way down, and weakness is a tragedy, and tragedy deserves pity rather than a war crimes vocabulary. The reader now holds 10 parts of documentation and can weigh the plea unassisted. What the defense cannot answer is the counterfactual, and the counterfactual is where every serious examination of this life finally arrives. Suppose no Wallis Simpson. Suppose the crisis of 1936 never detonates, and the man this account has followed through Lisbon telegrams, Mosley dinners, and fence-sitter interviews, is King of England in the summer of 1940, at the moment his country decides, by a margin of a few voices in a cabinet room, whether to fight on alone or seek terms. The documented record of his stated views, in exactly that summer, is already in this account and needs no restating. A constitutional monarch cannot make policy, the objection runs, and the objection is true and beside the point, because in May 1940 the question of fighting on was close enough that the throne's occupant, his known views, his channels, his capacity for the indiscreet word to the ambassador of a neutral power, sat inside the margin of history. The historians who have gamed it, Lowney explicitly, Ziegler by unmistakable implication, converge on the same conclusion. The presence of George VI, dutiful, decent, stammering, and steady behind Churchill, was a load-bearing element of British survival, and the man he replaced was, at minimum, a live risk at the exact hinge of the century. December 1936 was sold to the world as a romantic catastrophe. Read against 1940, it was a national deliverance carried out 8 years early, by accident, and the woman the establishment spent 50 years refusing to name was the accidental instrument of it. Which brings this account, at its end, to the person who understood that arithmetic before anyone, held it longest, and took it to her grave in silence. The small, steel-cored woman who stood at the second funeral, visibly moved, 85 years old, and said nothing. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, has appeared at the edges of every part of this account. Closing doors, the HRH decision of 1937, the post-war ban on employment, the frozen decades, the coldest front of the family war. The standard reading of her 50-year enmity is personal, and the personal reading is documented and real. She held the Windsors responsible for forcing the throne onto her husband, a shy man of fragile health who had never wanted it, and when George VI died at 56, worn through by a war and a role, she assigned the early death, in her private accounting, to the brother who had run. Courtiers recorded the temperature of it for half a century. What the personal reading misses is that her position was also, tested against everything the archives later disgorged, simply correct. She had concluded in 1937 that the Duchess would not last and must never carry royal rank into the wreckage. The marriage lasted, but every file opened since has vindicated the deeper judgment beneath the prediction that the pair of them were unsafe at any proximity to the crown. She outlived the Duke by 30 years, and the Duchess by 16, died in 2002 at 101, and in all that time gave no interview, published no memoir, and never once pronounced the Duchess's name in public. It was the longest silence in the story, and the most articulate. She had won, comprehensively, on every front, and the victory monument she chose was the refusal, maintained for 65 years, to acknowledge that a contest had occurred. And here the story delivers its final structure, the paradox. This entire account has been assembling, and it is worth stating plainly because everything documented across 10 parts locks into it. The institution needed the love story. From the moment of the abdication, the tale of the king who left for love was the safest available container for the facts. It flattered the departed man, spared the country the discovery of how close it had stood to a compromised throne, and converted a security crisis into a romance. So the institution licensed the legend, tolerated its 2 ghost-written testaments, gave it a wedding silence, 2 funeral ceremony, and a shared grave for its final tableau, all while its own archives filled with the contrary evidence, and its own government suppressed the Marburg file for 12 years to keep the container sealed. The Windsors, for their part, needed the same story from the other side. It was, as this account established in its earliest parts, the entire case for the defense, performed nightly in a borrowed house for 35 years. Legend and institution, exile and palace, spent half a century as hostile partners in a single publication, each maintaining the cover for its own reasons, and the cover held until every principle was dead. Underneath it, the truer sentence had been sitting in plain sight all along, and it is the sentence on which this account will close its argument. The Duke of Windsor's one unambiguous service to the British monarchy was leaving it. Everything the institution feared in him, the archives confirmed. Everything it built to contain him, the love story, the exile, the silence, worked. And the throne he vacated passed to the brother and then the niece, who between them made the 20th century the most successful in the crown's history. He spent 35 years in Paris believing himself the victim of an injustice, and the belief was the mercy, because the alternative available to him, the truth, was that his absence was the gift, that the institution's coldness was its gratitude, and that the family flag, flying at half-mast in May 1972, saluted, with perfect ambiguity, both the man and the escape. The evidence is filed, the verdicts are returned. What remains, for the final part of this account, is the reckoning of the smallest scale and the largest. What the 50-year performance cost the 2 people inside it, hour by hour, in the borrowed house among the trees, and what the story they died maintaining has been worth, in money and myth, to everyone who has sold it since, from the memoir serials of 1951, to the auction room of 1987, to the streaming dramas of the present century, which have introduced the couple to audiences their scandals never reached, wearing, one more time, the only costume the world has ever agreed to see them in. Before this account closes its ledger, 3 files remain open on the table, and they belong before the verdict because the verdict rests on them. They are the files the Paris chapters kept deferring, the German tour of 1937, the Bahamas years, and the long American season. Part 3 of this account gave the tour a single sentence. It deserves better than a sentence, because everything the Lisbon telegrams implied in 1940, and everything the Mosley dinners confirmed in the 1960s, was rehearsed in public, in front of newsreel cameras, in the autumn of 1937, 11 weeks into the marriage. The story of the tour begins with the man who arranged it, and the man is a story in himself. Charles Bedaux was a French-born, American-made millionaire who had built a fortune selling efficiency systems to industry, the stopwatch and clipboard methods that squeezed measured labor out of factory workers, and by the mid-1930s, his largest and most profitable client base was the Third Reich. Bedaux owned the Château de Condé in the Loire Valley, and in June 1937 he had lent it to the Windsors for their wedding, the ceremony no royal relative attended. The loan was not sentiment. Bedaux collected access the way he collected chateau, and within weeks of the wedding he presented his houseguests with a proposal, a grand tour of Germany, to study housing and working conditions, followed by a second tour of the United States on the same theme. The Duke would be recast as an international authority on the welfare of workers. The itineraries would be handled. The hosts would be respectively the German Labour Front and American industry. For the Duke, the offer answered the two hungers that this account has traced through every year of the exile that followed. It was a job, the thing London would not give him, and it came with a guarantee that mattered to him more than the job. The Germans would receive his wife royally. In Britain, by the letters patent of that spring, no one would call Wallis Her Royal Highness. In Germany, everyone would. The Reich's protocol officers were instructed, and the instruction was kept. For 12 days in October 1937, officials bowed to the Duchess of Windsor, wives curtsied to her, and she was addressed in the style her husband's family had withheld. It cost Berlin nothing, and bought exactly what it was designed to buy. The couple's guide and escort throughout was Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, a coarse, hard-drinking party bruiser who would die by his own hand at Nuremberg while awaiting trial as a major war criminal. This was the man who handed the Duchess her flowers. The British government had begged the Duke not to go. The embassy in Berlin was instructed to keep its distance, and did. No ambassador greeted the party, a snub, the German press noted with delight. The tour proceeded anyway, and the newsreel record of it, which survives and is viewable to this day, supplied the 20th century with some of its most quietly damning royal footage. In the Ruhr, miners lined up in their thousands and greeted the former King of England with the raised arm salute, and the cameras caught what the Duke did in return. On more than one occasion, the gesture his defenders would spend 80 years describing as a wave. At a training school of the SS Death's Head units, the couple reviewed the men whose organization would staff the camps. At Carinhall, Hermann Göring's hunting estate, the Duke was entertained by the Reich's second man, and visitors to that house in those years, including the Windsor's party, could see displayed on its wall a map of Europe on which Austria already appeared as part of Germany, 5 months before the Anschluss made it so. The tour's meaning required no decoding then, and requires none now. A Labour Front film crew followed throughout. The Reich was manufacturing footage of a former British sovereign blessing its social order, and the sovereign was cooperating take after take. The climax came on October 22nd at Berchtesgaden. The Duke and Duchess took tea with Adolf Hitler for over an hour, the Duke conversing in the German he was proud of, the interpreter Paul Schmidt recording afterward that nothing of political substance was exchanged in his hearing, an observation Schmidt paired with the sharper one that the Duke's sympathy for Germany required no translation. It is from the departure that history keeps the tour's most quoted line. Watching the couple leave, Hitler remarked to his interpreter that the Duchess would have made a good queen. The remark was meant as a compliment to her bearing. Read against the file this account assembled in Part 4, the plans Berlin drew up 3 years later for exactly that restoration. It reads instead like a man pricing an asset. The second half of Bedeau's project then collapsed, and the collapse measured precisely how far the Duke had drifted from the world's respect. The American tour was announced for November 1937. The former king would inspect the factories of the United States as a student of labor conditions, guided by the very efficiency baron whose systems American workers despised. Organized labor erupted. The unions denounced Bedeau as a speed-up profiteer, and the tour as a whitewash fronted by a Nazi-entangled prince. Baltimore, the Duchess's home city, prepared protests. Bedeau's American business partners, smelling ruin, cut him loose. Within weeks, Bedeau suffered a collapse and fled his own project, and the Duke cancelled, issuing a statement of injured dignity from Paris. The episode has a coda that belongs in the record. Bedeau spent the war deepening his German connections, was arrested in North Africa in 1943, and in February 1944, in American custody in Miami, awaiting a grand jury on charges of trading with the enemy, killed himself with an overdose of sleeping pills. The man who had hosted the wedding and built the tour died a suicide under indictment for treason against his adopted country. The Duke, asked about Bedeau in later years, preferred to remember the chateau. The tour fixed the couple's file in one more capital, and it is the capital that matters for the third piece of this part. Washington had been watching the Windsors since the abdication. After Germany, it never stopped. The documentary spine of that watching is the FBI file on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, opened under J. Edgar Hoover, fattened across the war years, and released in redacted form decades later under the Freedom of Information Act. where journalists found several hundred pages of surveillance reports, informant summaries, and memoranda routed to the White House. The file's contents divide into two categories, and honesty requires keeping them separate. The first category is verified activity. The Bureau, on authority that ran to President Roosevelt himself, physically monitored the Windsors during their American visits in 1941, logging movements, contacts, and correspondence, treating a former British king, formerly an Allies family member, as a counterintelligence subject. That happened. The paperwork survives. The President of the United States considered the Duke of Windsor a security risk worth tailing, while Britain fought for its life. The second category is raw intelligence, the unproven material every such file accumulates, and its most notorious item is the report of an informant, a European aristocrat relaying society knowledge, asserting that the Duchess's relationship with Joachim von Ribbentrop during his time as ambassador in London had been intimate, and that she had remained in contact with him afterward, which, if true, would have placed a channel to the German foreign minister inside the king's bedroom during the abdication year. Around the same rumor grew the legend of the 17 carnations, the story that Ribbentrop sent the Duchess 17 flowers, one for each occasion of their intimacy. No historian has ever substantiated the affair. The flower story is unverifiable society embroidery. Bloch and Ziegler both discount the liaison, and this account records it as what it is: an allegation the FBI wrote down, not a fact the archives established. What the file proves is narrower and, in its way, heavier. The suspicion itself was official, contemporaneous, and held at the highest level of the American government. The fear of the Windsors was not invented by later biographers. It was policy, in real time, in two capitals. Between the tour and the war sits one final document of the rehearsal years, and it completes the pattern, because in it, the Duke, for once, spoke entirely for himself. On May 8, 1939, standing on the battlefield of Verdun, where 300,000 men had died in the war he had served in as a staff officer, the Duke of Windsor delivered a radio address to the world, carried live across the United States by NBC, appealing for peace among the nations. The text, read cold, is a plea any bishop might have signed. The context made it something else, and everyone at the time read the context. It was broadcast days after Hitler had torn up the Anglo-German naval agreement, at the exact moment British diplomacy was struggling to convince Berlin that Britain's guarantee to Poland was serious, and its unmistakable burden, peace at almost any price, was an argument against his own country's policy, delivered by its former sovereign, over the head of its government, to the American public whose neutrality Berlin prized above all. The BBC declined to carry the broadcast. The palace was not informed in advance. The speech landed, by accident or design, on the eve of George VI's departure for his state visit to Canada and America. The trip meant to bind the democracies together, and drained a measure of the attention from it. Germany's press praised the address warmly. 4 months later, Germany invaded Poland, and the Duke's telephone, as ever, did not ring with his country's requests. The rehearsal was over. The performance, in Madrid and Lisbon, whose script Part 4 printed, was about to begin. But between Lisbon and Paris, between the telegram of August 1940 and the villa of 1953, there is a 5-year chapter this account has stepped over each time it passed, and it is the chapter Andrew Lowney's research did the most to blacken. Churchill, holding the Marburg problem in one hand and a war in the other, had solved the Duke in the classic imperial manner. He had given him an island, governor of the Bahamas, 3,000 miles from the fighting, a colonial backwater of sponge fisheries and winter tourists, where a compromised prince could do, it was calculated, no harm. The calculation failed. In those 5 years the Duke would describe the population he governed in language that survives in his own letters. He would attach himself to a Swedish millionaire, the Allies blacklisted as a Nazi instrument. His capital would burn in a riot, his policies helped ignite. And on a storm-lashed night in July 1943, the richest man in the British Empire would be beaten to death in his bed 2 miles from Government House, and the governor's response, within hours, would be to reach not for Scotland Yard, and not for his own police force, but for a telephone line to Miami, and 2 detectives, whose names would become synonymous with one of the most disgraced murder investigations in the history of British colonial justice. The Duke of Windsor stepped ashore at Nassau on August 17, 1940, into 90-degree heat, wearing a wool uniform, to govern a colony he had already appraised in private. His letters from the first months, quoted across the biographies, called the Bahamas a third-class British colony, and his wife's letters improved on his. She named the posting there St. Helena, after Napoleon's Terminal Rock, and described Government House with a decorator's contempt. The building was, in fairness, half derelict. What the couple did about it became the colony's first lesson in its new governor. With Britain under nightly bombardment and the colony's poor living in shacks, the Windsors secured public funds, augmented by their own, for a comprehensive renovation of the residence, and the Duchess ordered paint, chintz, and furnishings from the United States, while London burned. The local assembly voted the money. The local population noticed. The population itself, some 70,000 people, the great majority black Bahamians, appears in the Duke's private correspondence of these years, in language that his biographers have had to quote with a warning attached. He wrote of the islanders in the vocabulary of a plantation century, dismissed the capability of black officials as a class, and attributed the colony's every disturbance to outside agitation, since discontent among a people he considered contented children required, in his analysis, an external author. Editors of the local press who challenged him, he described in racial terms. Philip Ziegler, the authorized biographer and the most careful of the Duke's judges, weighed this file and rendered the verdict that the Duke's racial attitudes were ugly, even by the indulgent standards of his time and class. The ugliness was not incidental to what followed. It decided, at the two crises of his governorship, exactly what he did. The first crisis arrived in June 1942. The Americans, newly in the war, were building airfields on New Providence, a project employing thousands of Bahamian laborers at a local daily rate that stood at a fraction of what unskilled American workers alongside them earned for the same shovel. The disparity was arithmetic anyone could do. On the 1st of June, the laborers marched into Nassau, and by the 2nd, the march had become the worst riot in the colony's modern history. Shops along Bay Street looted and burned, troops deployed, several rioters shot dead. The Duke was in Washington when it began. Returning, he imposed a curfew, granted a raise of $1 a day with a free lunch, and then delivered his considered analysis to London. The riot, he reported, was the work of agitators of the Harlem type, men of mischief exploiting his islanders' simplicity. Loney's account, and the Bahamian historians before him, set that dispatch beside the wage tables and let the two documents argue. The laborers had rioted over pay. The governor had discovered communists. The shilling, it should be recorded, was pocketed, and the airfields got built, and the file went to London, marked resolved. The second crisis had been sailing in and out of Nassau Harbour since before the Duke arrived, aboard the largest private yacht in the world. The Southern Cross belonged to Axel Wenner-Gren, a Swedish industrialist of colossal wealth, founder of Electrolux, armaments investor, a man whose friendships ran to Hermann Göring, and whose stated vocation was mediating peace between Germany and the democracies. He had bought most of Hog Island opposite Nassau, dredged its harbour, employed hundreds, and established himself as the colony's resident Croesus. The Duke of Windsor took to him immediately. They dined, cruised, and corresponded. The yacht carried the Duchess to Miami for dental surgery. The friendship was conducted in the open, while the American and British intelligence services, watching the Swedes' movements between hemispheres, filled files with their suspicions. In the summer of 1941, Washington placed Wenner-Gren on the proclaimed list, the economic blacklist of persons deemed to be acting for the enemy, and London followed, and the richest man in the Bahamas became, overnight, a designated instrument of the Reich, with whom trade and contact were proscribed. The evidence behind the listing has been argued over since. What concerns this account is the governor's conduct, and the governor had continued the association to the very eve of the blacklist, defending Wenner-Gren in correspondence as a misjudged friend, and had to be formally warned off him by London. The friendship left a financial shadow, and the shadow is the hinge of everything that follows. Wenner-Gren, exiled by the blacklist to Mexico, established a bank there, the Banco Continental, and around it, in the war years, moved a scheme well documented in outline: the quiet transfer of wealthy Bahamian money into Mexican shelter, beyond the reach of British wartime exchange controls, which made the export of sterling capital without permission an offense approaching economic treason. The two Nassau names most persistently attached to the scheme were the colony's two richest men, the real estate power Harold Christie, and his friend and patron, the gold magnate Sir Harry Oakes. And the third name, raised by John Marquise's 2005 investigation and pressed hardest by Lowney, was the governor's own. The allegation, never proven and formally denied in his lifetime, that the Duke of Windsor was moving, or preparing to move, a portion of his own fortune along the same channel, in breach of the currency laws he was sworn to enforce. The allegation matters not because it is settled, it is not, but because of what it does to the events of July 1943. It supplies the one thing the official record of those events always lacked: a reason for the governor to be afraid of an investigation. Sir Harry Oakes was the British Empire's largest resident fortune, a Maine-born prospector who had struck one of the richest gold mines on earth in Canada, taken a baronetcy, and moved to the Bahamas for the tax weather. On the night of July 7, 1943, he was at Westbourne, his beachfront house 2 miles from Government House, his family away in Maine, a tropical storm over the island. His last dinner guest, and overnight house guest 2 rooms away, was Harold Christie. Sometime in that howling night, someone beat Sir Harry to death in his bed, with a weapon that punched 4 wounds into his skull, soaked the bed in accelerant, set him alight, and scattered the feathers of a gutted pillow over the burning body. Christie, by his own testimony, slept through all of it, discovered the corpse in the morning, and attempted, he said, to revive with sips of water a man who was burned, cold, and partly cremated. The first calls from the house that morning did not go to the police station, they went up the hill. What the governor of the Bahamas did upon learning that the empire's richest man had been murdered in his jurisdiction is the reason this case has never closed. His first recorded act was suppression. He invoked wartime censorship to hold the news, an attempt overtaken within hours when word reached the American wires. His second act was the one that decided everything. The colony possessed a police force with a competent CID. Scotland Yard, war or no war, was reachable. British security officers sat in New York. The Duke telephoned none of them. He placed a personal call to Miami, to a police captain named Edward Melchin, whom he knew from his Florida visits, and asked him to fly over with a colleague, and the stated purpose of the request, preserved in the record and almost unbelievable to read, was to confirm the details of a suicide. The dead man's skull carried 4 separate punctures. Melchin arrived that afternoon with Captain James Barker, a fingerprint man, and the Duke placed the investigation of the century in their hands. Within 36 hours the Miami men had solved it, to their own satisfaction, by arresting the one suspect the island's white establishment would be happiest to lose: Alfred de Marigny, a twice-divorced Mauritian count who had married Oakes's teenage daughter Nancy, feuded openly with her father, and offended Nassau society and Government House alike. The Duke, who detested him, had personal knowledge of the feud. The case against him rested, in the end, on a single piece of physical evidence: a fingerprint, said to be de Marigny's, said to have been lifted from a Chinese screen beside the murder bed. It rested there because Barker, the fingerprint expert, had somehow arrived in the tropics without a fingerprint camera, and so, contrary to the first rule of his own trade, had lifted the print on tape rather than photographing it in place, destroying the possibility of proving where it came from. 2 further acts completed the machinery. The crime scene was left open, prominent Nassau visitors wandering the room, handling the walls, while Christie, the man asleep 2 doors from the butchery, was treated from the first hour as a witness rather than a suspect, though a police officer would later testify to seeing him in town, in a truck, during the night he swore he never left the house. And the head of the Bahamas Police, Colonel Erskine Lindop, who was heard to resist the rush to charge de Marigny, was transferred, mid-case, on the governor's authority, to Trinidad, a promotion timed so that the colony's senior policeman was 3 islands away and unavailable to testify when the trial opened. Years later, Erskine Lindop told a Bahamian editor that a suspect had broken down under his questioning before the transfer, and that the man in question had continued to move in Nassau's best society. He never named him. He went to his grave not naming him. The trial, in October and November 1943, drew the world's press to a colonial courtroom and turned into the demolition of the Miami detectives. Nancy Oakes, 19 years old, certain of her husband's innocence, hired the American private investigator Raymond Schindler, and the defense he armed did the work the Crown's investigators had prevented. It established that the famous print could not have come from the surface it was claimed from, its background pattern matching nothing on the screen, and drove Barker into contradictions from which his testimony never recovered. The implication put openly to the jury was that the Duke of Windsor's hand-picked experts had manufactured the only evidence in a capital case. The jury acquitted de Marigny after under 2 hours, and appended, in the same breath, a recommendation that this innocent man be deported from the colony anyway. The governor's administration executed the recommendation with relish. De Marigny, cleared of murder, was expelled toward Cuba. His young wife followed. The marriage did not survive the wreckage. The Duke had been, for the duration of the trial, conveniently absent in the United States. And then, nothing. No new investigation was opened. Requests to reopen, including from the Oakes family's own hired men, were declined by the governor's administration, and the murder of Harry Oakes passed into permanent unsolution. The cottage industry of theories, Christie's debts, the Mexico money, Meyer Lansky's casino ambitions, blooming precisely in the vacuum the governor's choices had created. The two detectives met the ends their performance predicted. Melchin faded. Barker, disgraced and drug-addicted, was shot dead in 1952 by his own son, who was exonerated. De Marigny, who lived to write his account in 1990, framed the question that has outlasted every theory, not who killed Harry Oakes, which the botching made unanswerable, but why the governor moved so fast, so strangely, to make it unanswerable. Loney's answer points at the Mexico Trail and the Duke's terror of where a competent investigation might wander. Ziegler's gentler answer offers a vain, panicked amateur protecting his colony's tourist image. The reader may choose. The dead man's case file cannot vote. In March 1945, weeks before the war's end and before his term expired, the Duke resigned the governorship, the only public office he ever held, and sailed away from the islands, having added to the record 5 years that even his defenders narrate at a whisper. What he sailed toward, this account has already established from the other shore, the guarded house on Boulevard Suchet, the tax arrangements, the long wait. But between the landing in France and the settled Paris of the villa lay a restless decade this narrative has crossed only at its endpoints. Years of borrowed castles and ocean liners, and one October night in the English countryside when a thief climbed through a window and lifted, in a single suitcase-sized box, the whole glittering evidence of the marriage, and set off a scandal in which, for once, the Windsors were the victims, and still contrived to look guilty. On the evening of October 16, 1946, while the Duke and Duchess of Windsor dined in London, a thief climbed a drainpipe at Ednam Lodge, a country house near Sunningdale in Berkshire, entered through the open window of a child's bedroom, walked past a landing where servants could be heard below, and left the way he came, carrying a locked box the size of an overnight suitcase. The box was so heavy that 2 of the Windsors' own staff had been needed to carry it upstairs a few days earlier. It contained very nearly the entire jewel collection of the Duchess of Windsor. The couple were in England for the first time since the abdication decade began, and the circumstances of the stay were themselves the insult that framed the crime. No royal residence had been offered, so they were guests of the Earl and Countess of Dudley, a few miles from Windsor Castle, close enough to see the flag. The Dudleys had offered the use of a safe. The offer was declined. The box lived under the bed. When the theft was discovered just before 7, the Duchess returned from London, in a state the Countess of Dudley recorded, with aristocratic frost in her memoirs. Wallis demanded the entire household staff be interrogated like suspects. A third degree the Countess refused to permit, noting that her servants were old and devoted, and that the demand itself told her something about her guest. Scattered evidence turned up within a day. Earrings dropped on the golf course at Sunningdale, a Fabergé box abandoned on a windowsill, a string of pearls that had belonged to Queen Alexandra left behind in the rough, too identifiable, the police concluded, for any fence to touch. The rest, insured for a figure the press put between £20,000 and £25,000, and worth many multiples of that in any later money, vanished completely. Then the case did what everything around the Windsors did. It curdled into insinuation, in every direction at once. The public, 10 years deep in its verdict on the couple, floated the theory that the theft was an inside job for the insurance, a suspicion fed by how readily the insurers paid and how promptly the couple sailed for New York. Palace circles nursed a different grievance, the durable legend that among the stolen pieces were emeralds of Queen Alexandra's that the Duke had improperly taken for Wallis, royal property lost through royal spite. A story the surviving inventories never substantiated, but which refused to die because it was too useful to both camps. Proof of theft from the family, or proof of the family's obsession, depending on the teller. The Metropolitan Police file on the burglary was sealed, and stayed sealed until 2003, when it opened, and when a career burglar named George Taters Chatham separately confessed in old age to the crime. The mundane truth, a professional thief and a careless victim, finally stood available, half a century too late to compete with the mythology. The episode's lasting document is the smallest one, the Duchess's rage at the servants, recorded by her hostess. It is the only occasion in the whole 50-year record on which the Duchess of Windsor is described as losing her composure entirely, and it was not over the Duke, or the family, or the war. It was over the box. The box mattered because of what the collection was, and what it was explains half the social history of the following 20 years. The Windsor jewels were not an accumulation, they were an argument. Denied rank, the Duchess wore capital, and the Duke, so vigilant over grocery bills, spent on stones without limit, commissioning from Cartier and Van Cleef, pieces designed around the couple's private mythology, crowned hearts, inscribed dates, the panther and flamingo figures that would one day detonate the Geneva salesroom this account has already visited. Each anniversary produced its exhibit. The collection was the marriage's ledger, kept in a form the world could see across a ballroom, and the Duchess deployed it through the post-war decades as systematically as a treasury deploys reserves. The ballroom itself, in those first post-war years, was the Château de la Croix, the great white villa at Cap d'Antibes, the couple reoccupied in 1945 and kept until 1949, and the household style there completed the pattern the Paris villa would later perfect, so it needs only its own details here. Liveried footmen on the Riviera in 1946 austerity, dinner served on gold plate while the coast around them queued for rations, and in the master bathroom, famously, a bathtub of gilded swan design that every memoirist of the coast recorded, because it was the single object that best said everything. The neighbours along that shore in those seasons included Winston Churchill, painting at nearby villas, and the deposed and abdicated royalty of half of Europe. The Duke golfed and brooded among them as the senior exhibit of the class. When the Croix lease ended, the caravan moved through rented Paris houses to the arrangement of 1953 already recorded. But the true centre of the Windsors' year, from the late 1940s to the middle 1960s, was not in France at all. It was on the west side of Manhattan's Park Avenue, on the 28th floor of the Waldorf Towers. Every autumn, with the punctuality of migrating birds, the Windsors crossed on a liner, occupied their suite at the Waldorf, and conducted an American season that ran through the winter. New York until Christmas, then Palm Beach, then New York again, then the spring crossing home. America was the half of their life where the arithmetic of 1937 still ran in their favor. Britain would not receive them. American society bid for them. Hostesses competed in print for their presence. Charity balls doubled their tables when the Duchess's acceptance was known. The couple sat in permanent state at the center of what the columns called café society, the new post-war aristocracy of money, publicity, and dress designers, of which they were, by universal consent, the reigning and only royalty. The Duchess worked the machinery like the professional she was. The annual best-dressed lists, which she led year after year until the compilers essentially retired her into an immortals category, were not vanity but statecraft. the one league table on earth she was permitted to win. Her apparatus was famous, fittings at Dior and, later, Givenchy timed to the Paris collections, the hairdresser Alexandre de Paris summoned across the Atlantic, a wardrobe catalogued and deployed with quartermaster's discipline. Behind the couture stood the discounts. The great houses dressed her at rates approaching zero, and jewelers lent freely because the Duchess of Windsor photographed in a garment was the best advertisement in the industry. Even glamour, in that household, was negotiated wholesale. The Café Society court had its wars, and the best documented of them deserves its place because it shows the Duchess operating at full power. Elsa Maxwell, the squat, tireless professional party giver who functioned as Café Society's master of ceremonies and gossip columnist, had been for years the Windsor's impresario in America, staging the galas at which they starred. At the start of the 1950s, patron and impresario fell out, and the quarrel was conducted for half a decade in full public view, Maxwell needling the Duchess in her syndicated column, the Duchess striking Maxwell from every list that mattered, society dividing into camps, the feud itself becoming a running entertainment, the press covered like a title fight, until a formal, flash-lit reconciliation was staged. Where else? At a ball, in 1957. The content of the war was nothing, the form was everything. Denied a real court, this account has shown the Duchess building substitute courts in a Paris villa and a jewel vault. The Maxwell feud was the same instinct at work in a third theatre, court politics, conducted to the death, over placement at parties, because placement at parties was the only jurisdiction left. The Duke's American decades ran on a parallel and smaller track, and its stations mark, better than anything in Paris, what remained of him. In 1956, the couple sat together in the Waldorf suite for Edward R. Murrow's person-to-person, live primetime television, the medium's highest-rated celebrity interview, and performed the marriage for the American mass audience with the polish of the professionals they had become, the Duke genial about golf and gardens, the Duchess crisp about menus, an act refined nightly for 20 years, now syndicated coast to coast. In 1960, he published a family album, a slim, ghosted volume of reminiscences about royal clothes and royal relatives, the literary equivalent of selling the last furniture from the attic. Reviewers received it with the embarrassed kindness reserved for a grandee reduced to trade. In 1965 came the film A King's Story, Jacques Levien's feature documentary of the abdication, built around the Duke's own on-camera reminiscences, narrated by Orson Welles, respectfully received, Oscar-nominated, and constituting, with the memoir serials and the paid interviews, the completed conversion of the abdication into a licensed entertainment property, decades before any streaming service arrived to inherit the franchise. And in April 1970 came the strangest and most telling evening of the whole American residency. President Richard Nixon, who as a young congressman had been received kindly by the Windsors and never forgot a kindness, invited the couple to a white-tie dinner in their honor at the White House. It was, after 34 years, the nearest thing to a state occasion either would ever again attend. The East Room, the toasts, the Duke replying with practiced grace about the country that had given him his wife. Aging Washington and Café Society mingled. The evening was a genuine success. The 75-year-old Duke was photographed beaming beside the President of the United States. The reader of this account is equipped to complete the picture. The photographs began. The government of his own country had never, in 3.5 decades, seated him at such a table. The honor he craved from London arrived, at the end, from Washington, from a president who would himself leave office in disgrace, at a dinner that his niece's court, consulted in advance, had registered with polite indifference. He had, at last, the recognition of a head of state. It was the wrong state, and everyone in the room was too kind to say so. Set end to end, the American seasons answer a question the Paris parts of this account kept raising without settling: what the couple actually did with the 40-odd years. The answer is that they toured. The Exile was structured as an endless season: autumn crossing, winter suites, spring return, summer at the mill, a calendar of appearances substituting for a calendar of duties, financed by the tax arrangements, the discounts, the publishing deals, and the hospitality of the rich, performed with total discipline, until the bodies gave out. It was, judged strictly as professional celebrity, 4 decades of flawless execution, the first modern career of its kind, conducted by 2 people trained for a different job entirely. Judged as a life, the couple's own recorded verdicts, her weariness at living out the great romance, his unanswered letters to London, have already been entered in evidence, and nothing in the ballrooms contradicts them. The season ended where this account has already stood: the cancer, the chair by the window, the 2 coffins at Frogmore 14 years apart. What remains now is only the summation, the final weighing this narrative has deferred through 13 parts. What the whole performance cost the 2 people inside it, what it has earned everyone who has sold it since, why the legend has outlived every file that disproves it, and what a visitor standing today at the plane tree at Frogmore, reading 2 unequal gravestones, is actually looking at. Every claim examined across 13 parts of this account, the files, the affairs, the tax deals, the murder inquiry, ultimately leans against a single load-bearing wall: the proposition that whatever else was true, the man loved the woman, and the woman loved the man, and the love redeems the ledger. That wall deserves its own inspection before this account closes. The materials for the inspection exist in the couple's private letters as published, in the testimony of the people who knew them longest, and in 2 correspondences, kept secret for decades, that between them rewrite the romance from both ends. Begin with the man, and begin before the woman, because the pattern precedes her. Through the 1920s, the Golden Prince of Wales conducted a 16-year attachment to Freda Dudley Ward, a married Englishwoman, and the letters he wrote her, thousands of them, published long after both were dead, stunned even hardened historians, less for their passion than for their register. They are the letters of a child. The prince writes in nursery diction, begs, sulks, threatens despair over trivial separations, and refers to himself in the diminishing third person, the correspondence documents, in his own hand, a dependency so absolute that its object functioned less as a mistress than as a governess with a waiting list. When Wallis Simpson displaced Freda's successor, the American-born Thelma Furness, in 1934, the machinery simply changed operators. The prince's telephone calls to Freda were cut off at the switchboard on instruction. 16 years ended without a note, and the couriers of court gossip observed that the new incumbent had grasped, faster than her predecessors, the true nature of the vacancy. It was not a lover the heir to the throne was seeking, it was a keeper. The men who worked for him had reached the same diagnosis in less printable form. His assistant private secretary, Alan Lascelles, the most quoted courtier of the century, recorded that during a 1920s tour, he had privately hoped the prince would break his neck in a riding fall, telling the prime minister of the day so, and being answered that the prime minister agreed. That exchange, between the heir's own secretary and the head of his future government, took place years before anyone in England had heard the name Simpson. The point of entering it here is chronological. The court's despair of Edward, the judgment that something in him was unfinished and unfinishable, predates Wallis entirely. She did not break the man the legend says she broke. She inherited the fragments and, unlike every predecessor, declined to hand them back. Why she declined is the question her own secret correspondence answers, and the answer has been in print since Michael Bloch published the letters and Andrew Morton organized their meaning. Throughout the abdication crisis, and for years into the marriage, the Duchess of Windsor maintained a private correspondence with Ernest Simpson, the husband she had divorced to marry the king. The letters are not cordial housekeeping. They are letters of grief. She writes to Ernest that she cannot forget him, that in the wreckage of her new circumstances, she misses the calm of the life they had. She signs with old endearments. She continues the correspondence, in this key, while the world is being told she is living the century's great romance. Ernest, a gentleman to the point of self-erasure, kept the letters and kept the silence, declining every fortune offered him by the press for his story, remarrying quietly, and dying in 1958 as the only principal of the abdication who never sold a word of it. The woman for whom a king gave up his crown spent the first years of the marriage writing homesick letters to the man she had given up to take him. Both halves of that sentence are documented. The legend survives them only because so few of its consumers have read the mail. Morton's 2018 account, building on Anna Pasternak's parallel research, pushed the inspection one room further and identified the third man, the one the Duchess's letters and conduct point to, as the actual love of her life. Herman Rogers was a wealthy, cultivated, kind American, a friend from her China years in the 1920s, in whose villa at Cannes she sheltered during the abdication storm, whose steadiness every witness of those weeks recorded as the thing that held her together, and whose presence she sought, decade after decade, with an openness her tightly governed life permitted nowhere else. The evidence is circumstantial in the way that only lifelong patterns can be, the surviving endearments, the testimony of Rogers's second wife, who stated flatly, and with irritation, that Wallis had been in love with her husband all her life, and the recorded scene at Rogers's 1950 wedding, where the Duchess of Windsor, a guest, behaved toward the bride with a possessive rudeness that the wedding party discussed for years. Rogers died in 1957. The Duchess's surviving letters around his loss carry a grief her letters about no one else carry. None of this convicts her of an affair. That is not its weight. Its weight is comparative. Set the file of her feeling for Herman Rogers beside the file of her feeling for the man she actually married, and the second file is the thinner one. What the marriage itself contained, from her side, her most candid recorded remarks, distribute across the decades, with terrible consistency, and they have all been entered in earlier parts of this account, or are entered now. The weariness, the sense of confinement, and, in the version her friend the columnist recorded from the abdication winter itself, the plainest of all, her protest that she had never wanted this outcome, that she had been prepared to leave, and that the abdication was his doing, an act she could neither prevent nor escape once done. Historians have treated that protest skeptically, since it was also her best defense, but her conduct in December 1936, the documented telephone calls from Cannes, begging the king not to abdicate, supports it. The man's final act of devotion was performed over the explicit objection of its beneficiary. She then spent 50 years administering the consequence, because, as this account established at the Donahue chapter's close, the marriage was the verdict, and the verdict required a warden. And the man? What did the Duke of Windsor actually receive, in exchange for the throne, the family, the country, and the 35 years? His own answer never varied in public, and this account has watched him perform it from the memoir serials to the television age. No regrets. The woman, the happiness. The private record, assembled across every part of this narrative, permits a more precise accounting. He received, first, exactly what the Dudley Ward letters show him seeking since young manhood: management. A governing will to replace the Crown's governing institutions, a person to decide his days, correct his stories, order his kilts and his hours. The household testimony of Part 5 described the arrangement in operation, and it is enough here to note that it was not the accident of this marriage, but its purpose. He received, second, a cause. The campaign for her rank and dignity gave the emptied decades their only through line, a grievance to rise for in the morning. The cruelest reading of the exile, available since the letters opened, is that the family's refusal of the HRH was, functionally, the greatest gift they ever gave him, an inexhaustible occupation. And he received, third, an audience's version of love, performed nightly by a disciplined partner who never once, in 50 years, failed him in public. Whether he received the thing itself, the private record is nearly silent, and the silence is the finding. In the tens of thousands of published words of their correspondence, hers to him rings managerial, brisk, maternal. His to hers rings, to the end, like the Dudley Ward letters, with the names changed, the same nursery pleading, 4 decades on, from a man in his 70s. The letters do not document a great romance. They document a great arrangement between a man who could not function alone and a woman who could not leave. Policed by a world that had been told a story neither of them dared stop telling. The fairest witnesses left the fairest summaries, and 2 may stand for the rest. The Duke's lifelong friend and best man, Fruity Metcalfe, who loved him and was shabbily discarded by him in the war years, wrote in a letter home the sentence biographers keep returning to, that the Duke was incapable of caring for anything or anyone beyond the Duchess, that beyond her the world simply did not register. It was offered as a lover's testimony and reads, at this distance, as a clinical one. not devotion as a virtue, but attachment as the last function of a personality that had shed every other. And from her side, the summary belongs to the remark her intimates quoted from the late Paris years, when a friend asked the Duchess, in effect, whether it had all been worth it, and she answered with the arithmetic of her situation, rather than its advertising, that she had wanted a comfortable life among friends in her own country, and had instead been handed a legend to maintain, alone, in someone else's. The answer contains no self-pity and no love. It is a professional describing her assignment. So the wall does not hold, or rather, it holds something other than what the legend built on it. There was need, on his side, oceanic and lifelong, and there was endurance, on hers, disciplined and total, and there was, the fairest reading allows, the real tenderness of long partnership, two people against a world that had made each the other's whole predicament. What there was not, on the evidence of their own hands, was the thing the 20th century was sold, the love that outweighs a kingdom. The kingdom was not outweighed, it was traded, by a man fleeing a role he could not perform. For a smaller role he could, and the woman was less the prize of the transaction than its collateral, and the love story was the receipt, written afterward, in everyone's interest, over both their objections, and then enforced on them for life, which leaves only the receipt itself, the last artifact standing. The two people are dead, the files are open, every claim in the legend has been audited in these parts and found unpayable, and yet the legend is not merely alive, it is growing, licensed and dramatized, and streamed to audiences born half a century after the funeral. Its two principals now permanent characters in the world's imagination, wearing faces hired by the decade. Why the story survived its own disproof, who profits from its maintenance, what the house in the Bois de Boulogne is becoming even now, and what the two stones under the plane tree at Frogmore finally say to a visitor who has read the whole file, is the last part of this account. In the winter of 1978, 6 years after the Duke's death, and 8 years before the Duchess's, British television broadcast a 7-part drama called Edward and Mrs. Simpson, and something without precedent happened inside the sealed house in the Bois de Boulogne. Lawyers acting for the Duchess of Windsor, a woman by then beyond speech, sued to stop it. The program, built from Francis Donaldson's unsparing biography, showed audiences of millions a version of 1936, assembled from the documents rather than the memoirs, and Maître Blum, in her client's voiceless name, fought it in the courts of two countries, extracting restrictions on its French broadcast. The suit is the perfect specimen with which to open this final part, because it displays, in one legal action, the entire machinery this account has spent 14 parts dismantling: the legend, incorporated, the truth, litigated against, and the human being at the center, silent, bedridden, and represented, her story now an asset under management, defended like one. The asset has outperformed every estimate since. Count the vehicles. The 1978 series began the dramatizations. A procession of television films carried the franchise through the 1980s and 1990s. In 2010, The King's Speech, with the abdication as its hinge, took the Academy Award for Best Picture and reintroduced the Duke to a global audience as the glamorous, unsteady brother of its stammering hero. In 2011, Madonna directed W.E., a defense of Wallis built openly on the romance reading, and from 2016 the Netflix series The Crown installed the exiled Windsors as recurring characters before an audience measured in the hundreds of millions, dramatizing, across its seasons, the very files this account has walked through: the Marburg Papers, the 1945 return, the deathbed visit of 1972, and introducing to viewers born in the 21st century a couple whose scandals predate their grandparents. Each vehicle skews the emphasis differently. Several are openly hostile. It makes no difference to the underlying franchise. Sympathetic or damning, every retelling renews the property, and the property is the couple themselves, the two most bankable supporting characters in the monarchy's modern repertoire. The Duke of Windsor spent 35 years failing to find employment. Dead, he has never been out of work. Why the legend survived its own disproof is a question with a cold half and a warm half, and both belong in the closing ledger. The cold half, the institutional half. This account established at the verdict stage, and will not re-argue. Every estate with power over the story needed the romantic container, and the container was built to outlast its contents. But institutions cannot force an audience to keep buying, and the warm half of the answer lies with the buyers. The Abdication is the only story the British Crown has ever produced in which the institution loses, in which a human impulse, whatever its real nature, visibly defeats 1,000 years of machinery, and audiences have never stopped wanting that story to be what it appeared to be. The files this account has read, the Lisbon Telegram, the Earnest Letters, the Oakes case, ask the audience to surrender the one royal fairy tale that ends with the fairy tale winning. Most audiences, offered the choice, decline the files. It is not ignorance. It is preference, and the franchise industry exists to serve it, and no archive opened in 1957 or 2003 or any year to come will alter a preference. The legend, in the end, is not maintained against the public's will. It is maintained at the public's request. The physical remains of the story have meanwhile been sorting themselves into their permanent places, and the sorting has its own eloquence. The papers rest in the Royal Archives at Windsor, catalogued beside the records of the family that fought 40 years to contain the man who generated them. The historian's access that produced Ziegler and armed Lowney continues, and each statutory declassification adds pages to the case that no dramatization uses. The jewels, dispersed at Geneva, in the auction Part 9 recorded, resurface piece by piece at intervals, and each resurfacing repeats the 1987 lesson at compound interest. Individual Windsor pieces have since resold for multiples of their already delirious prices, the Panther bracelet alone commanding, at a 2010 London sale, a sum that made it for a time the most expensive bracelet ever auctioned. The market, which sentimentalizes nothing, has priced the provenance ever upward, because the market understands what it is actually selling. Not gemstones, certified fragments of the story, the only relics the 20th century's civil religion of celebrity ever canonized. And the house, the villa at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, has outlived its second act as completely as its first. Muhammad al-Fayed's shrine restoration, recorded earlier in this account, dissolved after the deaths of 1997. The lease lapsed back over time, the contents were dispersed in their own auctions, and the city of Paris, still the freeholder it was when it handed the keys to an exiled king for a token in 1953, assigned the property in the 2020s to a French heritage foundation, the Fondation Mansart, with a stated plan to restore the villa and open it to the public, a museum, at last in name as well as function. When it opens, visitors will file through the 14 rooms this account has furnished, from testimony. The hall where the abdication desk stood, the drawing room of the person-to-person broadcast, the sitting room where a dying man rose from a hidden intravenous line to bow to his niece, the bedroom where a widow lay speechless for 6 years while her lawyer governed in her name. The tour will be beautiful, the guides will be discreet, the gift shop, it is safe to predict, will sell the love story, because the love story is the ticket, and the ticket has never once, in 90 years, failed to sell. Which leaves the 2 stones, and the end of this account, where the 2 people are. The royal burial ground at Frogmore is not open ground. Visitors come on the few days the gardens admit them, and few who come know what they are walking past. Behind the mausoleum of Queen Victoria, under a plane tree, set apart at the edge of the family plot at a distance the eye reads before the mind does, lie the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, side by side, as negotiated in 1965, executed in 1972 and 1986. The stones are plain, and their inscriptions, quoted at the second funeral in this account, conduct between them the final exchange of the whole 50-year war, his, bearing the royal name and style, restored in full to a man safely dead, hers, 4 words, the rank withheld in stone forever, a few hundred paces from the graves of the women who withheld it. The family that would not have them in life has them now entirely, inside its own walls, on its own terms, labelled in its own hand. It is the most articulate cemetery arrangement in England, and it says what this account has found the whole record to say. The institution won, completely, on every front, and could afford, victorious, to be hospitable to the remains. Stand at the plot with the file this account has assembled, and the 2 figures resolve for the last time. Under the larger stone, a man who was handed, at birth, more unearned advantage than any human being of his century, and who is documented, at every tested moment of his life, converting it to less. A prince who emptied the role of meaning, a king who fled it in 11 months, a wartime liability his own country had to garrison on an island, an exile whose politics shamed even his defenders, a husband whose great act of devotion was performed against the wishes of its object, a man who ended as this account found him at its beginning, waiting in a borrowed hallway for a telephone call from a family whose deepest gratitude was his absence, and under the smaller stone, the harder figure, the one the century never agreed how to judge, a woman of real ability and no illusions, who pursued an advantage until it detonated beyond her control, begged the detonation not to happen, and then, trapped in its crater, administered the wreckage for 50 years with a competence none of her enemies ever matched, performing to her last conscious day a role she is on record as never having chosen, over the life he cost her. The legend calls them the lovers of the century. The file calls them something smaller and sadder, and, in the end, more human. Two people who mistook each other for an exit and spent half a century locked in the door. The century keeps the legend. It is entitled to. Legends are what centuries keep. But the record now exists in full, assembled by the biographers this account has leaned on throughout. Ziegler with the archives, Wilson with the witnesses, Bloch with the letters, Morton with the buried correspondence, Lowney with the files the government fought to hold, and the record's verdict fits on the same small stone as the Duchess's name. He was king for 326 days. He was an exile for 35 years. The love story was the cover version, and the cover, as covers do, outsold the original, and the original is buried at Frogmore, under a plane tree, at a carefully measured distance from the family plot, where the institution that commissioned the cover can keep, forever, a discreet and watchful eye on it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.